Lord Eddard Stark. As the most featured character in the first book, and by that I mean he has the most chapters, many people saw him as the main character. Well, that notion seems long gone now, given how there is no main character at all in A Song of Ice and Fire, not a singular one anyway. And of course because, well, Ned's dead. Ned's dead, baby. How readers tend to see Ned now is as a father figure, in some ways fulfilling the tropes and roles more common in storytelling for that type of character, while doing what George does so well, breaking a lot of those tropes and going against the grain in some ways, but not all. It's a huge part of how the story begins. Ned gives Bran more than one teachable moment during that execution scene in his first chapter and the things that happen just after. He gets a discussion about fear and the responsibilities that come with caring for a dangerous pet. But today we're not here to talk about how Ned educated his children. We're here to look back and talk about how he was in turn educated by his parents and siblings and those around him. It takes a village to raise a child, they say, but in this case, it's a castle and several surrounding villages or towns like the Wintertown. As we all know, or should know, how a parent treats their own children is deeply rooted in how they were treated by their own parents in turn, and of course, their parents before them, and other factors, of course, but primarily parents. Here's a quote that expresses that quite well.
"It all goes back and back," Tyrion thought, "to our mothers and fathers and theirs before them. We are puppets dancing on the strings of those who came before us, and one day our own children will take up our strings and dance on in our steads."
It's a bit of a cynical take, but, this is Tyrion, so his parents are a little more his parents was a little more controlling than most. Not all parents view their children as marionettes like he says, they're puppets dancing on strings. But we are undeniably impacted by those who raise us, whether good or bad, or even if that impact comes from not being there at all. Tyrion very much impacted by the lack of a mother, even though there's no direct impact from that. There's a lot of indirect effects from that. They make choices for us, parents do, and the world around them pressures a lot of those choices, whether they're rich nobles from illustrious houses or whether they're orphaned in poverty or in something similar to that. Ned's upbringing in many ways, though, is atypical for a Stark. Sure, much of it was typical. He trained for war, he rode horses, he read and learned to write and math and all that. But other aspects were not, and some of those are painted as normal for us in A Game of Thrones. And then throughout the passage of the books, we learn actually Lord Rickard, Ned's father, did some things differently. He broke some traditions along the way and was involved in serious political intrigue alongside that, because of that, you could argue, which in itself was a bit of a tradition among the Lords of the North, meaning staying out of Southron power games. That's how it usually goes. And young Ned was not raised to rule, let alone play politics with those far more versed in such. And by the time he was thrust in position as Lord of Winterfell, his parents were gone, and all but one of his siblings, who joined the Night's Watch soon after, were all gone. So he didn't have uncles or aunts or even cousins really to help him, though he did have people like Maester Luwin, House Cassell, and others like Old Nan, people who had been around since he was a kid. But he was also raised partly in the Vale, so he did have insights about the South that other Starks would not have been privy to, which was kind of the point of his father putting him there in the first place. So we'll explore how that sets him apart somewhat from previous Lord Starks. Not to mention, of course, that portion of his upbringing in the Vale is the reason he was so close to Robert and Jon Arryn and a few others, which, of course, is a huge part of how the backstory plays out. With all that in mind, it's no wonder we aren't trying to cover all of Ned's life in one episode, because his early life is so jam-packed. We've got all our hands full enough already with all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's another fun topic I think we've got lined up for you today. How are you feeling today, Sean? You ready for this one? You got a beverage prepared?
It's slowly revealed to us that Ned's upbringing maybe wasn't as standard or traditional as it seemed at first.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think Ned is presented as a relatively conservative character.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not like conservative in the sense of modern American politics, but conservative in the idea that
traditions.
he's not. quick to action. He's kind of reserved personality,
Yes.
and he's, from the north where things are, not quite as dynamic and bustling and, maybe rooted in the old gods. They're the oldest house, on and on. But all that said, Ned is actually pretty progressive. He's pretty okay with Arya learning how to fight with a sword,
Yeah.
and lots of elements of his decisions and outlook are much more progressive than you might think, and maybe more progressive than even people in what might seem to be a more progressive area like King's Landing. Not that everyone there is necessarily conservative, but I feel like Ned would have less prejudices towards gay people, for example, than the average person in King's Landing.
Yeah.
And maybe even in King's Landing, certain people like Tyrion might be more okay with it, but like, we're not going to give you any power. Like, he's still worried about the optics of it.
Yeah.
Whereas I wonder if Ned might be more okay and less worried about the optics and more worried about doing the right thing. Anyway, we've got many thoughts along this line.
In general, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Sparked immediately.
That's a good call. So yeah, lots of ideas for what Ned might have gone through in his childhood, and looking back at why we got where we are now because of those reasons. Shout out to our good friend Nina. Of course, her notes, as almost every episode, features her thoughts. And I want to shout out her blog, as I often do, goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. That's 1L in alley. Latest question there is she got a question on Anya Waynwood and Harry Harding and Sansa, and talking about the possibilities of marriage and Anya as an advisor there, and maybe even going to Winterfell and whether that might happen. So it's basically an exploration of what Sansa's entourage, at least part of it, might look like when and if she returns to Winterfell. I'm going to say when. Well, I won't say if. we sometimes we throw these ifs in just for, because there's a 0.5% less than, I don't know, there's no percent chance she doesn't go back to Winterfell. Anyway.
So, by the way, I skipped past it with those thoughts, but I do have a drink here with a couple new things. There's a new Mountain Dew flavor called Purple Thunder. Purple basically Thunder. Tastes like grape medicine.
It tastes like thunder.
And there's a new Red Bull flavor called Juneberry, which also tastes kind of like purple medicine.
It is June, so it's appropriate that you're.
But I also added the rainbow naked drink and a raspberry sparkling ice, which makes up for the medicine flavor.
It's pretty good. It is very red.
Purple color.
I could see that being the heart tree red, the red leaves of a heart tree. It's a northern heart tree red. I've got on my really old Ned Stark on the Iron Throne Veil of Maya shirt. Veil of Maya is a metalcore, deathcore band that I've seen live a few times, and they had this shirt for sale, which I'm pretty sure they weren't licensed to sell, but I bought it anyway. And of course,
it's all promoting this stuff.
You can't even see where it says Veil of Maya, but you can see Sean Bean's face. And anyway,
I made a mistake. I meant to wear my Branzig shirt, and I forgot to change out of my bronze shirt, my '80s bronze shirt.
Bronzig instead of Branzig, yeah. So this episode was voted on by patrons. Next week is going to be Baelor Breakspear. It's going to be another one of these not live episodes that we're going to record in advance and post. People can still hang out in the chat if they want. There's still going to be a premiere. It'll be up at their usual time as a live stream would be. We just won't be responding to live chats because we're recording it in advance. But anyway, it should be ultimately a very similar experience for the majority of y'all. If this episode ends and you're still wanting more, we have suggestions for related topics to things that come up in this one, and we'll hit those at the end, along with the answer to this trivia question, which is, who is the first character we see take a drink of any kind of beverage in a Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire? It's funny that I specified a Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, because you're like, if I didn't say a Game of Thrones, would you think, wow, does no one take a drink until A Clash of Kings? It's like there's no one taking a sip of anything until the second book. It's like, yeah, people were just too busy. George, those chapters are shorter in a Game of Thrones. They didn't have time for things like beverages, everybody's too busy. So, yes, that is the question, and I will reveal the answer at the end.
One thing, Aziz, that you didn't really center this episode around, but that was prominent in my mind, was the nature versus nurture debate, if you will. We're talking about what makes Ned who he is and how his youth went and how that plays out. And I don't have an exact note to say right now, but I know I'm going to have several thoughts along that line to come up
Right
on the way.
That's a good place to be. I totally agree. It is difficult to frame this as nature versus nurture without having firsthand knowledge of Ned's upbringing, but I agree that it still has a big place in this conversation regardless. Yeah, and so after this episode, something I hope you'll get out of it is in your next reread, and I hope you do a next reread, tisk tisk, no, not tisk tisk, you will enjoy it thoroughly. And a lot more understanding of why Ned makes the decisions he does will come in that reread, and why he reacts the way he does to certain things, why certain things really bother him, why he takes certain things to heart, why certain things he kind of shrugs off that you might think would matter more, and how so much of what's happening around him reminds him of his teen years all over again. History repeats itself for Ned Stark in a lot of very uncomfortable ways. He's seeing a lot of the same things happen with a lot of the same people. Robert, Tywin, Jaime, different houses, if not the same individuals. And of course, his own family upbringing is at the core of all this. And let's start with a quote from A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 2, as Ned expresses frustration at his own uncertainty in the face of Robert's offer to marry Sansa to Joffrey.
And I was only 12 when my father promised me to your brother Brandon.
That brought a bitter twist to Ned's mouth. Brandon, yes, Brandon would know what to do. He always did. It was all meant for Brandon. You, Winterfell, everything. He was born to be a king's hand and father to queens. I never asked for this cup to pass to me.
Perhaps not, Catelyn said, but Brandon is dead, and the cup has passed, and you must drink from it, like it or not.
Ned turned away from her, back to the night. He stood staring out in the darkness, watching the moon and the stars perhaps, or perhaps the sentries on the wall. Catelyn softened then to see his pain. Eddard Stark had married her in Brandon's place, as custom decreed, but the shadow of his dead brother still lay between them, as did the other, the shadow of the woman he would not name, the woman he had borne his bastard son.
This passage is doing a heck of a lot of work, right? It's steering us towards believing, wrongly, that what Cat believes about Jon Snow's parentage, but Ned's refusal to tell her the truth is rooted in his promise to Lyanna, which is part of his upbringing. Why he did that, why he was so loyal to his sister, it's all a product of his upbringing, that devotion, that love, as well as what he knows about his best friend's views on Targaryens. He knows how Robert would react if that secret got out, so that's part of his difficulty here as well. He thought his sister would marry his best friend Robert and that Brandon would rule Winterfell, so his life definitely didn't go the way he thought it would. I mean, who sits there predicting the death of most of their family? So, of course, he didn't expect it to go the way he did. And though we're given several apparent red herrings about who Jon's mother is, one of the prominent names is Ashara Dane, whom Ned might have married instead of Catelyn. You got me saying Caitlyn. Sean, what's your... Instead of Catelyn, had things gone differently. So when George R. R. Martin writes that it's a shadow laying between them, it's not just Jon's parentage he means by it. There's a lot of shadows that Brandon's death left behind, that Lyanna's death left behind, that Rickard's death left behind. Not to mention stuff on Catelyn's side, too, from her family, but that's a bit too big for us to bite off all at once today. Ned married Catelyn to preserve the arrangement made by his father. He didn't get forced into it. He wasn't told, you must marry this woman because I'm your Lord Father. I mean, that would have happened in different circumstances had his father still been alive. But he was the Lord of Winterfell when he married Catelyn. He had the right to refuse that. He could have been, nope, I think not. Oh, Sean just lost a poster.
Oh, that's crazy.
That's funny. That doesn't usually happen. Actually, that's the first time that's happened.
Yeah, that is.
And though Ned was indeed probably not that cut out to be a Hand of the King, at least not in the times he found himself as Hand of the King, he did turn out to be a great Lord of Winterfell. So it's not like he wasn't good at ruling. It just, that one job more cut out for than the other. He is tough on himself. He holds himself to a high standard, which is not something he learned as an adult so much as something he learned young. I mean, he probably continued to learn that as an adult, but he didn't start like that as an adult. It was something he grew up doing, which is a reminder that education isn't something we only glean from others. Our own education, our own growth, a lot of it comes from within. Not all of it, certainly. And this is part of the nature versus nurture argument, or a subset of that, the way you nurture yourself and the way you engage with nature around you. And that's a big part of Ned's story. He did have a huge support system around him for a while, and then it was gone all of a sudden very quickly. Plus, as he says in the quote, that huge support system was geared towards educating him as a second son. he was well supported, but it wasn't steering him in the direction that he ended up. It put him on a different path, one that he had to switch. Even Robb, who found himself thrust into lordship and then kingship before expectations for such, in a tumultuous time to say the least, he was at least educated to be the eventual Lord of Winterfell. His education was for a firstborn, so he was at least more prepared in that sense. Not to mention he was educated by our subject today, who did live through similar times with a lot of similarly tragic outcomes, like the loss of their father to a king who wasn't all there mentally, right? Very similar. Ned gets his head chopped off by Joffrey. Brandon and Rickard are killed by Aerys. And of course, there were all a lot of manipulation by powers behind the throne in both these cases as well, but also not a part of today's episode. That is our target today, to look at Ned's life from birth up until about the point where Robert's Rebellion began, right up to the point where he lost his support system, right up to the point where he became Lord of Winterfell. I'd say that's a fair line in the sand to say, okay, well, if he wasn't a man before this, he certainly is now, because he has the responsibilities of an adult, whether he was fully ready for it or not. But he was about 19 at that point, so he wasn't young by the standards of these times, but still young by a lot of standards. And you're never too old or young to lose your entire family. All right, let's go back to the beginning, but first Jon has a comment.
Yeah, this is one thought that I had about the nature versus nurture thing. I was reminded, I think it was a couple weeks ago when we did the Highgarden episode, and in fact I think it's come up a few times, but the idea that almost all the houses that we have much history on have at least one leader in their background who was insane or drunk or idiotic or some problematic leader in the past. But except for the Starks, we don't really have an example of some abusive, wild leader in Stark history. And so this is just one of it's complicated trying to study, like, I don't know, evolution and nature versus nurture, but this is like a dynamic that scientists consider. Is it a more warlike society? Maybe they're that way because they're under more pressure, right? They're in a contentious land where tribes are constantly fighting, and so whatever trait might be in someone that encourages aggression or violence gets encouraged. Like, the people who are like that are more likely to survive and lead. And so then even maybe when they finally conquer their enemies, there's that DNA, that bit of genetic hereditary personality is still in that culture now.
They have to have someone to fight. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the flip side of that might be true too. If you're in a culture where you need to be cautious and plan ahead, if you need to have a conservative mindset, like the North might have,
yes.
People who are that way, the impulsive, reckless people weed themselves out of the gene pool. Calm, forward-thinking people become the leaders and pass those genes on. And maybe that's why in the Reach, when there's bountifulness, they can get away with screwing things up and they can pass on some bad genes and still have enough food. But in the North, it just won't work. You have to have had this genetic tendency for calmness and forward thinking, and that's why we don't get these bad leaders. But on some level that might affect, and of course there's always exceptions, however much you could even measure these genetic influences, but it is a tendency we've certainly noticed that seems to be the case with Ned, and as far as we can tell, his father, and but maybe not Ned's brother.
Ned's brother is maybe a little different. Yeah, that's a something that comes up in this episode, some of those differences. And so you're right, they can't afford to have that kind of leadership because it risks wiping them out entirely because of natural consequences. Yeah, literally, nature. So he was born in the year 263. His dad, of course, Rickard Stark, we don't know when he was born, but he probably wasn't old at this point because all of his children were born within a pretty quick succession, within roughly a 9-year period, all the 4 children. So we could guess that's unlikely to have been later in life, for the simple reason that he didn't marry multiple times, so it's not like he just didn't have children with his first wife. That would explain not having kids early. His mother was Lyarra Stark. They were first cousins. We go through the genealogy pretty thoroughly in the Royce episode because they both come from the Royce Stark marriage that came several generations back. And we know even less about Lyarra than we know about Rickard. I've somewhat assumed she died well before Rickard. Well, it's a pretty safe assumption, honestly. Now let's take a look at some events that happened around this time to set the stage for what the Westeros was like, maybe what the vibe was like, things like that. 4 years prior to Ned's birth was Summerhall. Okay, so Rhaegar was born at Summerhall, right, during the conflagration. So that's the death of Aegon V, and Jaehaerys II becomes king, and Pycelle becomes Grand Maester that same year. So presumably after Summerhall, because of the Grand Maester died during Summerhall. Now 260, the following year, was the War of Nine Penny Kings, and the death of Robert's grandfather, Lord Ormond, by Maelys the Monstrous. And Robert's father, Steffon, becomes Lord of Storm's End. And, of course, the War of Nine Penny Kings is when a lot of new friendships between various lords became set up, because they formed friendships on the battlefield and on campaign. That includes Lord Rickard having friendships with several of these southern lords, which leads to the relationships that form the entire backbone of the story, or at least the early backstory of the story, Robert's Rebellion and all that. The year 261, the following year, is the year of the reigns of Castamere. The following year, 262, is when Jaehaerys II dies. Only a 3-year reign, and then Aerys becomes the king, and Tywin is named Hand almost right away. And Brandon Stark and Robert Baratheon are both born that same year. So it's a pretty important year. And then the following year, Ned is born, and Tywin and Joanna are married. Then the following year, Stannis is born. 2 years after that, Jaime and Cersei. The following year, 267, is probably when Lyanna was born. It may have been 266. And then Benjen, it's less clear, sometime in the next few years. I lean closer to the year 271. But it's not super important. 267 is when Tywin becomes Lord of Casterly Rock. And 268 is when Peter Baelish is born. Another character with a very small role in this episode, but anyway. So that's roughly what was going on around then. Though go ahead, Sean.
I just want to say I didn't think of it in these terms before, but we've supposed a lot about like the rise in magic in the world, and it seems to be centered around Dany birthing the dragons, the Red Comet coming, the others. What the cause and effect is unsure, but a lot of these key players were born in the wake of Summerhall.
Yeah.
Maybe that was when the magic was at least beginning to rise, or the seeds had been planted for it. I don't know.
It's possible, because maybe that's why part of why he thought it would work, because of some environmental conditions. Yeah, there's still an awful lot of mystery there.
Maybe it did work. Maybe it like blessed these births or cursed these births.
Yeah. So though Aerys and Tywin later turned to animosity, they were very close and worked well early on. Let's not forget that. And this is that era. So that's important to remember, because Casterly Rock having a strong relationship with the throne, that's a big deal to the other High Lords. It might even be a threat. Some of the positioning and marriage alliances made in this era were a response of sorts to these developments, and there were no lack of new friendships, like we said, made during the War of Nine Penny Kings. Tywin and Aerys are an example of that. Although Hoster and Peter's dad as well. Although Tywin and Aerys knew each other before the war. He was already a cupbearer for Egg.
I think anyone who's been watching your Crusader King streams knows that Hoster and Tywin were really close.
That's right. In my Crusader King streams, Tywin and Hoster became lovers. Mm-hmm. And Tywin is now Tywin is broken up again, because he was already broken up about the death of Joanna and would not take a new lover. But this was the real reason why, is because it was a cover story for his bisexual side. But Hoster died in the stream, so he became bereft yet again. Now he's taken on a new young lover. He's got like a 20-year-old man that's coming around. I think at first he was like, nah, but I think eventually he's like, yeah. He's like, all right, I'm getting lonely here.
Tywin would roll in his grave hearing this.
Yeah, he would. He really, really would. That's why we were doing it.
So Tywin already knew Aerys before, but you can presume they got a little closer. As battlefields tend to do that. You're suffering and going through danger together. You tend to grow closer to people you're around. So Jon Arryn and Rickard Stark, though, is probably the one that matters most here, though. All that Tywin Aerys stuff is a build-up to the key of the cornerstone of relationship as far as Ned's education. Rickard, Nina points out, would have been, of course, the leader of the northern forces. This is one of the few times where the warden system comes into play. Warden of the north, south, east, west, all that. The reason it so rarely comes into play is because it's meant for foreign invasions, which, that's so rare that there are foreign invasions for Westeros, but War of the Nine Penny Kings was one such event. So Rickard Stark, as we've gone over in other episodes, there's no episode, or there's no time we ever know of when a Stark wasn't the Warden of the North. So it's a pretty safe assumption. Jon Arryn was definitely Warden of the East. So they would literally be the same rank, working on the same problem and same planning sessions and all that. And I suppose they got along well, because I don't think you send your son to foster with someone that you hate, especially when you have plenty of other choices, especially when you don't normally send your sons to the South at all. So there's a very strong case to be made that they not only got along, they got along well, right? I think that's a pretty safe assumption. The Tullys as well, because those were the three houses that really were the core of this new sort of proto-Southern conspiracy is what it's called in some circles, but we don't have to call it that. It's just a
It doesn't have to be a
power
conspiracy.
block.
Yeah, it could just be like they all got along.
Yeah, mutually beneficial arrangement between people who trusted each other and had a lot of power, right? And maybe they were worried about what other people's power bases were going to do to them. So, yeah, lots of reasons for them to act the way they did in response to what was going on around them in the realm. Nina says, with past kings like Aerys I and Aegon V not holding up what these lords might have seen as the crown's end of the feudal bargain, Rickard, Jon, and the Tully brothers might have thought that it was high time they made sure of that by forming an alliance and better asserting themselves as a group rather than individually against the crown. Like, obviously it's like a union of high lords, a labor union of high lords. That doesn't sound right, does it? A labor union of high lords? No, it's not a labor union. It's a union-ish thing, but not a labor union. No, definitely not. So
Terra Incognita says the Stab Alliance.
Yeah, Stab Alliance.
Stag. Tully, Arryn, Baratheon.
Stab, I love it. Or Bats.
Bats.
Backwards.
No.
Tabs. I mean, we can do these all
They
day.
met at the tourney of Harrenhal, so Bats, right? That makes sense. So, of course, this alliance means marrying his children to southern houses. That's not a change for the Arryns or the Tullys or the Baratheons. They were already doing that all the time, marrying their children within other southern houses. So that to them, this is nothing new. So Rickard is the one that's having to do something a little different. So he's the one that has to change something in the north. He's the only one breaking tradition to make this alliance work. Because there's no like, oh, we don't ally with Starks. It's not a thing for the South. Who doesn't want the Starks' help? They're too powerful to want them on the other side, right? But a lot of times they just stay out of things. So yeah, this is one of the many things that makes it different. This is the world Ned Stark is born into, where southern and northern politics are an entirely different game, and it's not a settled game because this is a new thing. It's like, well, how is this going to play out in the long term? In A Song of Ice and Fire, we're still seeing that long term. It's only been about 40 years since that. That's not long term in terms of history playing out. That's just like 2.5 generations at most, right? So yeah, it's still playing out.
Even going back to the conquest. I don't know what you call it when the Targaryens took over.
Yeah, the conquest. Yeah.
Especially given that a key dynamic that existed at that moment went away. I don't know, 100 years later, the dragons, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's, even aside from Robert's Rebellion, like things are still unfolding. That's still a relatively small amount of time in history, So the idea that alliances and positions and attitudes are still forming in the Seven Kingdoms.
Yeah, that's very true. Good said. So it would have already seemed odd, not just in the north, but to other houses when Catelyn was betrothed to Brandon by Rickard a bit later. So a lot of people were like, well, that's interesting. Is this dangerous? So this is part of why the politics was a little more of a bubbling cauldron, because there were some unusual things happening, some alliances that, if you look back at World War I, part of the reason it happened was because of entangling alliances. People were like, well, we pledged to help this country if they got attacked, and they got attacked, so we got to fight. And that country pledged to attack us if we, and then they're honoring their promises, and it makes the war gigantic. And that is pretty much what happened in Robert's Rebellion, to a certain extent. So Rickard had married his cousin Lyarra, like we said, first cousin once removed. His father had married a Locke. His grandfather had married a Blackwood. Lyarra's mother was Arya Flint. So that's the point being, these are all northern houses minus the Blackwood, which is still an old gods worshipping house. So the culture is the same, even though it's in the south. So going back there, if I'm only naming the lords, look at these names. We got Lara Royce, who we mentioned already. She's the one that they both descend from. But after that, we have Miriam Manderly, Alice Karstark, Robin Riswell. Cregan Stark married a Nori, a Blackwood, and another Stark. Cregan's mother was Gillian Glover. His grandmother was Lysa Locke. Alaric Stark married a Mormont. Even if you expand it to sons and daughters of the main branch, it's still almost exclusively northern to northern marriages. So I list all those not for you to remember them, just to throw the weight of how unusual this behavior was of marriages between north and south. And this is a lot of tradition that's being broken here. I mean, we're talking thousands of years of this. Even after the conquest, like you say, Sean, it didn't become normal, which maybe it would have become normal, but it took this long. If it did become normal, it took this long, 250, 260 years for it to really actually happen. And yeah, and I point that out because of it's so different, right? And Nina says, yeah, and Rickard probably had every reason to think that this was necessary, even though it was such a break from tradition. He was the great-grandson of Baron Stark, who was born probably not too many decades after Dagon Greyjoy was reaving the northern coasts, when the crown did not help them, left them to their own devices, and it didn't go well. It took until the crown did finally intervene for the problem to stop. So that memory of the crown's failure and inability to protect its constituents, which is a primary duty of your liege lord, to protect you from threats. That's the like you submit to their authority in exchange for protection. Well, they don't protect you, then you maybe be looking for a different arrangement. Well, yeah, maybe. And that's part of what's going on here over those successive generations, is the North was thinking a little differently about, well, they're reluctant to protect us because they're busy with their own internecine squabbling, which is what it was about. Bloodraven is cited as being too worried about Bittersteel and the Golden Company to come send help. They don't have dragons. I mean, yeah, it's just evidence of the relationships breaking down.
The dynamics are changing. Kind of like I was saying earlier, that it's not like everything was fully fleshed out after the Targaryens took over. And then, aside from how they might have fleshed out, dragons going away changes things. Dorne becoming part of the fray of things. That's another variable that was kind of new. That's going to naturally add some monkey wrenches to how things always had been. They're not going to be that way anymore.
Yeah, it's like the door was held closed by a rusty chain, and it would take very little to kick that down, but it takes someone actually kicking it down for it to happen. Like, until someone actually does it, it's still that thread is still held in place. So Ned continued with that pattern. It's part of why we go back a little before Ned's upbringing or a little forward in his life, depending on which aspect of this you're thinking of. But he continued with the southern marriages. He allowed that continue. Maybe he just like, okay, this is how we do things now, or maybe, as I said early on, it's because some of the same things were happening that made those concessions necessary. But he was also raised in the South, which, unlike his father, which naturally attuned him more to what's going on down there and to Southern cultures, and being less like distant from it. It's not as like foreign to him as it would have been even to his own father.
You know, I just thought of another thing, by the way.
Go for
it. The King's Road.
Sure, yeah.
Just the ability to travel back and forth between those southern kingdoms. That makes it a lot more difficult to form alliances, much less marriages, when it's hard to even get there or know who's there. So
ships,
that's just another relatively new thing that's going to change the dynamics of the realm.
You're right, because that probably the King's Road probably wasn't completed northward until about 70 AC, if not a little later. So, yeah, it hasn't even been 200 years since that connection has been fully made.
And when you think 200 years, that seems like, in some ways, a long time. When you compare like how old the Starks are, it's like 10%. It's not that long, really, like less than 10%. But in terms of like how long a person lives, it's long. But when you think of in modern times, you know, rulers don't last that long. But in this world where you have like kings and inheritancy, 200 years might only be like 6 leaders. That might only be like 6 chances for someone to do something different, you know?
Yeah. And of course, an overwhelming factor for Ned and why he gets so involved, which isn't a factor for Rickard, is he's Robert's friend. If the Lord of Winterfell has no friends in the South, he can ignore what's going on there a lot more easily than when it's his best friend that needs his help, and is his best friend who had formerly been betrothed to his sister. And at this point, when Robert's Rebellion breaks out, the perception with a lot of people, and we don't know what Ned knew at that time, regardless of what he thought later, he may have been among those who thought his sister had been kidnapped at the time. Like later, I think he figured out that wasn't the case. But at the time, he may have thought it was. So he's like, well, my sister's a hostage. My best friend his head's been called for too, just like me. Of course I'm going to help, right? So it's That's the entangling alliance. It's not, in this case, it's not an entangling alliance, it's an entangling friendship. Similar result, but a little different in terms of how it forms. Now, without a war, like, we don't know who Robb would have married. We don't know who Ned would have arranged Robb's marriage to. Maybe another northern girl. Maybe that would have just been the way to go. Just return to the old traditions. But Ned did sign off on Sansa to Joffrey, not because he wanted it, but because, he was sort of talked into it. It was also part of the presentation of Lysa's accusation against the Lannisters. That Catelyn's like, well, now you really have to accept the job of Hand of the King. You got to find out how the Lannisters killed Jon, And he's like, yeah, you're right. Which means you got to accept this marriage proposal. It's kind of an awkward thing to add to, like, well, we got to investigate this murder, so my daughter's going to marry this guy. But, it's not quite that simple. So
also, his daughter marrying that guy, aside from the details of the personalities that they also didn't know, it's not totally crazy. It's sort of like a positive thing. It's sort of like an honor. It's not some, even if it's not exactly tradition, it's not like he's breaking tradition to do some weird, crazy thing. Yeah. He's breaking tradition to do some honorable, forward-moving thing,
Yeah, there's a lot of built-up trust amongst the Northern Lords in what the Starks do, I think. I think they understand that they let you, if you start to do something a little unusual, you probably have a good reason for it. It's not necessarily true with other leaders because they don't have that great long-term reputation for success. So I want to repeat how normal this all seems at the beginning, all these relationships and these arrangements. And it's just like, well, later you realize this is not normal at all. Yeah, it's like, oh, it's just marriages. Of course, noble houses having marriages. So it's framed so normally, especially with little things that back it up, like Bran wanting to be a knight. That's really unusual, but of course, it doesn't seem unusual. A little kid in a medieval setting wants to be a knight. That's so normal, right? But it's not, because he's a son of the North, right? That's why it's not normal. But that doesn't click right away. And the farther we dig, and the more we do episodes like things like this, the starker the difference becomes. Hey. And Ned does, like you said, Ned doesn't do these things to change traditions. He does them for good reasons. Like a huge example is he built a sept for Catelyn in Winterfell. Apparently that had never been done before. What a huge break from tradition. Now, if he had been worshiping at the sept, then it would be a problem. But he still worships at the Heart Tree, so they're like, whatever, big deal. They have a sept at White Harbor. It's been there forever. There's probably a few other septs in the north. It's not offensive just to have them there.
And it's probably, however much Ned or other leaders thought about it, it's probably better for the sake of peace in the long term for people to become accustomed to this, aware of it at least. It'll eliminate some prejudices or some conflicts if people just get more exposure. And like, Sansa, it's not like Ned like arranged for Sansa to marry some blacksmith's son bastard or some
Gendry,
or some Dothraki prince or something. It's the prince of the land. She's gonna be the queen. It's not like even someone who doesn't like the Southerners like, oh well, yeah, but she gets
like we're gonna have a northern queen.
Yeah, that's gotta. Everyone's gotta.
That was pretty much Catelyn's argument,
that,
and Ned was like, yeah, I can't really argue against that. Like, damn it, I want to argue against that, but it's especially because he knows his daughter wants that too. Like he understands that too.
Yeah, it's like in his mind, it's a win-win.
Yeah. So there probably were some, to repeat the phrase, Tywin rolling in his grave, there probably were some lords of Winterfell and kings of the north who rolled in their graves when there was a sept built in the north. But times have changed, and the current lords of the north didn't seem to care. At least there wasn't any loud complaining that we know of. And it's one of the reasons it's important to point out, not just because it's a change, because there were other opportunities for this. Yeah, Catelyn's a rare Southern bride, but rare, not unheard of, right? There have been Manderleys and Royces. So there's been other Southern brides that have been the Lady of Winterfell, and they didn't have, maybe they got to bring their, some personal statuette to worship to, but they didn't have a whole sept, right? So it's a pretty big difference. So Ned's early years, let's talk about that. Ned, 263 to 270, that's when he was the ages of 0 to 8. So too young yet for betrothals or to otherwise be used for his father's plans, but he was on that track. Whatever plans his father had at that point, he would have started with a standard education for a Stark second son, with maybe a few tweaks, as we'll discuss. In his case, he's only 1 year younger than his older brother, the heir. So this is a case where he's probably right there with Brandon doing everything. They've trained together, ride horses together, just do all the stuff together because their age is so close. They're only a year apart, and that's a really good way to handle things. You manage both boys together. You don't have to train them separately, well, you do eventually, but not when they're this age. So think a lot about Robb and Jon, similar maybe, because they're almost the same age as well, with one of them being subordinate to the other in terms of the pecking order, in terms of later inheritance and things like that. Obviously, that difference is a bit larger with Jon because he's viewed as a bastard, but it still lands him in a similar position where he's clearly secondary to his brother.
I was going to say that's another thing about the dynamic between, I guess, Jon and Robb, or Ned and Brandon, is it when you're close in ages like that, you're way more compared to each other. Does that make sense? Like if Robb and Bran, it's not like if Robb and Bran go out in the yard to practice swords that Bran feels like, I should be able to beat him, but he's better. Like, of course, he's like, like, it's not close. No one expects there to be. No one's like, but when they are close, when they're within a year of each other,
it's real competition.
Yes, it's like, yeah, you're not as good as your brother.
Yeah.
I'm like, you feel like you could or should be when it's that close. But if there's a 10-year gap, no one has that expectation. So that maybe makes it tougher, for the younger brother in that position.
And boys are taught to compete a lot. Like, that is part of the upbringing of culture for boys quite often, is you encourage that a lot. Like, it's so much of this is in the first chapter, Bran's first chapter. What happens when Robb and Jon have a little argument about whether the man was brave or afraid, whether he died well, and then they race to the bridge. It's like competition, right? and then they're like arguing over names for the wolves later. Yeah, just all this like little bits of competition, and that it strengthens them. At least that's the idea. That it's supposed to prepare them for like real battles later, and to show them who their real friends are, and they can count on each other, things like that.
There certainly is value to competition, but you got to imagine the effects on Ned or any second son's psyche in this scenario where, like, your brother is the chosen one.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That you're always gonna get second pick of everything. And it's not, no matter how good you are.
No matter
even if Jon could beat Ned, or Ned could beat Brandon in the yard with their fake swords or whatever, it still doesn't matter. You're still second place.
It's like what we see in House of the Dragon with Aemond. He becomes the best warrior. He's way better than his brother at everything. It doesn't matter. Even when his brother's like, I don't want it still doesn't matter. It's like, nope, he's the firstborn. That's it. The only way you're getting out of this is if he's dead or something like that, and his kids as well. It's like, oh, that's the only way that's happening, or other stuff that's not how it tends to go. Like, it has to take violence otherwise.
By the way, Succession just ended, and anyone out there watching Succession has got to be like drawing these parallels to Roman and Kendall right now.
Now, it should be said that it's not at all remotely unusual for the firstborn to die prematurely and inherit, and the secondborn to inherit. That was normal even for this era. We mentioned Baron Stark, one of the lords who died to this Dagon Greyjoy's reavings that they were unable to stop. He was a second son of his father, and his father was a fifth son who had inherited Winterfell. So there's plenty of cases where and of course Ned's grandfather Edwyle was not the firstborn either. Old Nan came to Winterfell to nurse a boy named Brandon, probably. She's not clear on her memory. And Brandon was apparently the older brother to Edwyle. Anyway.
Wait, Edwyle? That's a name?
Yeah, Edwyle.
EDWHILE?
No,
is there a Y?
It's always a Y, yeah. WYLE.
Just WYLE?
Yeah.
Edwyle.
So that's Ned's grandfather, Rickard's father, Edwyle. Yeah, that's the only Edwyle we know of. So yeah, you wouldn't have heard that one elsewhere. I'm pretty sure that's the only Edwyle we know of. Anyway. So yeah, if Ned ever beat Brandon at something, it would probably be a big deal for him, like, confidence-wise. But as you said, Sean, it wouldn't like mean he's going to now inherit or something. He would get a congratulations for that, and he would feel good about it. But yeah. Now, George says Ned was a better battle commander. Brandon was better at most martial things, horse riding, sword fighting. But maybe Ned was a little more cerebral, possibly. There's another reason for this that we'll discuss later, though. But maybe just in general, he was better at math and logistics and planning and things like that. And Nina has a nice catch here, points out that Arya was better at math than Sansa, and Arya looks more like a northerner, so that might be like a little point of pride, or just a little nod to taking more after her father than her mother. Because we don't know if Kat's good at math, but Ned may have. If Ned was, then this would fit. Like,
I was thinking with Ned and Brandon, it might be that Ned got stuck doing that more often, that Brandon got to do the cool, fun stuff. You know, he got to ride the horse and fight with the sword, and Ned had to take inventory of the swords and clean the horses up, you know.
and
Like
Brandon may have been too impatient for all that, you know.
yeah, he might have just skipped the math class.
Yeah.
But Ned has to find any edge he can to excel, so he would work on these things that Brandon didn't think were fun.
Like, I bet if they played Cyvass, Ned would have won that. Like, Brandon probably beat him at swords 9 times out of 10, if not more. But Cyvass, Ned had the edge there. But it's also safe to assume that Brandon was protective of his younger brother. This is a vibe all the Starks seem to have of these multiple generations, if not farther back. Of course, most noble houses have that in general, of you protect your family members, especially the ones who were younger than you. Not to say maybe Brandon didn't push his brother around a little bit. He probably did, but I don't know. But I doubt he would tolerate anyone else doing that. It's one of those things where he's my brother, you know? I mean, just look at how he says, come out and die to Rhaegar later when he's mad about what happened to Lyanna, or that he was the one to ask Ashara to dance with Ned. So the protectiveness is there. The helping out is there. So is the shyness.
And Lyanna similarly protected Howland Reed, right?
Yes, very exactly. So there's a lot of this, like, this is how the Starks are. That vibe is there. And Rickard probably, whatever guesses we make about him later, it seems safe to assume he carried that tradition on. It probably wasn't there just from him. It probably had been around a long time. The pack survives, right? The lesson Ned gives to Arya about, you know, when the snows come, you know, the lone wolf dies, the pack survives. So yeah, don't encourage lone wolf treatment or lone wolf behavior amongst Starks, especially not the ones in power. So yeah, they don't like bullies either. They don't seem to like bullying. So yeah, all the standard things that we see Bran doing. Bran is 7 when the story begins, so a lot of what we see his education of at the time, even when it transitions to education for someone that can't use their legs, is still a lot of the same stuff. And that's really important because Ned was fostered at age 8, so he's at the age Bran's almost at the age where he would have been fostered, presumably. Although, if you look at Ned's kids, they weren't, right? Like there was no, like, Sansa was still at home, Robb was still at home, so Ned may have had a different idea of fostering than his forebears because of the entanglements, maybe, who knows? But it's a very important little tidbit to, like, Ned had really held back on that to this point. So, yeah, I wonder about that.
I hadn't thought of that. I'm glad you brought that up. My mind's spinning a little bit on it. I wonder how affected he might have been by Theon coming to Winterfell. If maybe he felt more obliged to take care of this other kid, and he's not going to send one of his kids to be taken care of by someone else when he's already taken. Maybe that's. But he does have so many kids, and I don't know. I wish I had thought about that more before this moment. I don't know.
I think sometimes it depends on the lord. Like, some lords are clearly more aggressive about it than others. Some of them have more ambitions. Like, Ned didn't have ambitions like that, I guess is part of it. But, like, look at, say, again, bring up House of the Dragon as an example. The Hightowers had all those 4 children, and only one of them got fostered elsewhere, right? Daron. So it's not so simple. They have different needs and opportunities at the time.
Guilty Undertaker says, Bran is being fostered in a way by an ancient tree wizard.
Yeah, it's true. You're right. His fostering ended up not what anyone may have predicted, but it's definitely
Ned had nothing to do with that decision, though.
Yeah, it's true. Yes,
funny point, but still not the direction I wanted to think about, like why Ned didn't do it when he did. Like, I wonder if he was resentful of it, if he missed his dad, even if maybe on some level he appreciated the friend he made in Robert and appreciated the guidance he got from well, was it Robert Arryn? Jon Arryn. Sorry, yeah, Jon Arryn. But he still might have missed his home and missed his dad and missed his siblings. You know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would think so. And missed his brother. Yeah, missed his sister. And yeah, like a lot of things. Nina points out Ned would have also had some gender-specific lessons while at Winterfell too, much as his own children do. Like, Lyanna would probably have done sewing and dancing and singing and poetry and the harp. Ned would have doing basic arms training, right? The same sort of stuff Bran was allowed to have when the royal family read. Like, Bran trained with Tommen, right? And things like that. So when he got to the Eyrie, it would have been even more a part of his upbringing, because as you get older, you do more and more of that as you're more capable, as you have more stamina, as your body fills out, things like that. So, etc. What about the beginning? Another thing. Let's look at the first chapter, Bran is seeing an execution, and one of the debates right away is whether he's old enough to see that. Catelyn's like, I don't know if he's ready for that, and Ned's like, oh, 7's old enough to see an execution, so which kind of implies that he had seen one by that age, or it's typical for a Stark to have seen that by then, or roughly by then. So maybe that's a little difference between North and South, as Catelyn's coming at it from maybe what she experienced in the South. Maybe she didn't see executions young, but she was older than Edmure. So she would have seen when Edmure went to his first execution. And it might have been something like age 9 or 10, or maybe even a little older than that. So to Catelyn's like, this is a little young, but Ned is probably reflecting his own upbringing when he's like, nope, this is the appropriate age for it, at least for where we live. Might have even been younger. Like Rickard would have been like, start him off, better get used to the sight of blood, youngsters, let's take him when he's 5 or something like that. And they may not have had Lyarra around to advocate for waiting a bit. Or maybe she was all for it too. She's like, yep, get him started early. I'm a Stark.
I would hope that my kid never witnessed an execution. Like, never in their whole life. That's
doesn't seem necessary. Yeah.
I'm trying to rush it at all.
So thinking of Ned's kids as well, in that thinking of the opening scene, direwolves, pets. Like, did Ned have a dog? Right? Did he have a pet, a different pet? That'd be another thing he would have to give up when he moved to the Eyrie. Maybe he would take a new pet while he's there, because he's lived there for another 8 or 9 years. So that's time to form a bond with an animal again, or multiples.
A horse might not quite be the same thing as a pet, but
but
it's in a range, and he could have brought a horse with him.
Yeah, a lot of people love their horses, so it could. You never know, right? And like Lyanna loved horses, Brandon loved horses, so maybe Ned was a little different in that regard, but. Yeah, maybe that would have reminded him of his family and having a horse, because so many of his siblings were horse people. Speaking of, Brandon was eventually fostered with the Riswells. That's why he's a horse person, because the Riswells were horse people, and he loved to ride, so he got a lot of experience with that. So there'd be a year, roughly, if we assume the ages are about the same here. Let's assume Brandon was sent to the Riswells around age 8, just like Ned was sent to the Vale around age 8. So there would have been an interesting little single year where Ned would have been missing his brother, perhaps, but also had that alone time with his father. He had been his father's primary focus for about a year. That's pretty interesting, right? And maybe his primary focus of his mother as well, if she was still around.
Quick side note. What's the Riswell sigil?
Horses.
Is it a centaur?
It's a horse.
It's just horses?
Yeah, it's a horse head, black, I think black on bronze or something like that, yeah. But by the end of that year, of course, he's sent off to be fostered as well. So that short 1 year, it would have seemed like a long time, because he's, it's his age 7 to 8. And, when you're young, time, the relativity of time is a different matter than when you're much older. But it's interesting to note, I don't think it's a failure on George's part. I mean, he's only got so much room for all this stuff, and Ned is busy constantly with things happening in the moment to think back on his upbringing, right? But Ned doesn't have many memories of his father and none of his mother. This is in part because he was raised away from his family for most of his formative years, in part, but also because of what I just said about, the story having to be the way it is without all this extra material. Now, we want to know all that stuff, but it's there. We can read a lot of it between the lines. So maybe they weren't that close, him and his father, because of this short time together. And it's not like he got to know, like, a lot of times what would happen is you spend this time fostering, then you go back home, and you're back home for the next 8, 10, 20 years, and your father lives on, because Rickard wasn't old, as we said. He died prematurely, so he could have gotten to know his father better had things gone differently. But by the time his fostering was up, it was only a few years before the war broke out and his family was all slain. But it's possible that his father just wasn't a very warm guy. Or maybe he was a distant or cold man, more focused on his ambitions. Maybe even a little Tywin-esque. Not sure. One of the earliest lines in the series is Bran thinking about how his father's face changed from his father's face to the Lord of Winterfell, which he sees as two kind of distinct people. And later he sees that in Robb, where Robb is put on the face of Robb the Lord versus Robb, his brother, is like, oh, did you see the way that guy talked to me? Versus I'll hang you if you take your troops home, like totally different demeanors there. And this is, Robb had to have learned that from Ned, right? Where is he going to learn it from?
When we don't know when Ned's mom died.
Right.
Right.
Not at all.
So he may have become cold after her death. Depending on the
Yes,
timing when
absolutely.
she died and when he went to be fostered and everything, you could see there might have been especially imagine like since we don't know the details, like, but I can imagine something like the arrangements have already been made
Mm,
for Brandon to go off,
yeah.
and in the midst of that, the mother dies,
Mm.
and so now Rickard is losing his wife and his son at the same time. And so maybe the alone time Ned might have got with his dad might not have been good time.
That's true.
He might have
Yeah.
been going through depression or a shift or seclusion or whatever else.
You're totally right. I mean, we don't know when she died. We do know that, I mean, she had to have lived long enough to bear Benjen. So there's definitely several more years past Ned's birth. So she couldn't have died like when he was 4, but maybe 5 or 6. That's about the lower range, but maybe not till he was like 11, something like that. It's a fairly wide range, 5-ish, 6 years. Anyway, so also Ned has just had such a full traumatic life that of course he's not thinking about his childhood as much. He's also kind of just practiced at not thinking about the past. Perhaps you could look at it that way. He doesn't think about a lot of these things because he doesn't need to and he doesn't want to. His mind is a little more disciplined, perhaps.
Never mind, George might not have had the past fully fleshed out for him to think about, and or might have been trying to hide certain things from the past, but certainly was trying to hide certain things from the past too. So.
Yeah. So when you read, I want to repeat something I said at the beginning, but frame it a little differently. When you reread A Song of Ice and Fire next time, or especially just A Game of Thrones, when you hear these lines like Ned giving that fear speech to Bran or the Wolfpack speech to Arya, think about how he probably got that speech from his father, and maybe his father from his, and how long has that been passed down from Stark Lord to Stark Lord, or Stark father to Stark sons? And maybe some daughters mixed in there too. Well, definitely some daughters mixed in there too, because Ned was talking to Arya with the Wolfpack speech. So it's Rickard who uses that term Wolfblood in referring to Brandon's temper. It's actually not. Ned says it's his father who used that term, which kind of implies that Rickard himself wasn't like that, right? It kind of he recognizes that trait that occasionally pops up in Starks, but not within himself. I think that's how to read that. Do you agree, Sean? You think, or?
At least potentially.
Okay. You can't be certain.
Maybe we should. Yeah, maybe should read the quote or get the context better. But because you can imagine it, he might be telling Ned like, me and your older brother have the wolf's blood, but you don't. He might be saying it like that.
Okay, yeah, that's entirely possible. Like he's like, yeah, you need to recognize this thing. It may your kids may have it too.
Yeah.
Some of us have it, some of us don't. Your brother has it big time. Maybe he's like, yeah, I have it, but not as bad as your brother.
Yeah.
I don't go yell, come out and die to the crown prince when there's a mad king on the throne. I mean, yeah, no one's quite that. That's elite level acting without thinking. So yeah, I do really like the theory that maybe Rickard lost some of his warmth because his wife died so young, which again is part of why we think maybe he's a little like Tywin, because that is what happened with Tywin. Tywin had some warmth before Joanna's death. Maybe it wasn't all that much, but whatever he had, it vanished. And there's some evidence that it was a fairly substantial amount of warmth before Joanna's death, at least relatively speaking. So yeah, I mean, that is like losing your spouse is sure that can change your personality entirely for the rest of your life. That's very believable, regardless of who you were before. Even if you're kind of a cruel, callous person, that could still even that kind of person can be deeply impacted by that level of trauma, that level of loss. But as we said, it's too big of an assumption to be sure of when there's a life full of possibilities, but it fits well. It does fit well. All right. I asked for feedback from our Facebook group on things that are seen as coming-of-age events, things that we might want to think about in reference to this episode, milestones in a young boy's life. That would help us expand the conversation a bit, give fuller consideration to what else might have happened or mattered in young Ned's life. And this will help us for future installments on this subtopic when we look at other characters. We also get to make comparisons between real-world versions of this, which gives further illumination, potentially. Like his first dagger, his first sword, being given that one to own and hold and swing rather than a wooden practice sword. That's probably a pretty big milestone for a Westerosi boy. First kiss, first dance, sexual experience perhaps as well, but a lot of them maybe wouldn't have that till marriage, so it's not necessarily something we can assume. But still, that would be a relevant potential inclusion.
Also, a lot of times they get married young, and they might
right.
not be considered a real man until they're married. Also,
that's a good point. Yeah, you're right. Or some are like, you're not a real man until you have a child, or you kill someone. Like, whoa, these standards are pretty high. Damn. So some of these seem really outlandish to our society, but you can hearing them said about Westeros. It's like, yeah, that sounds about right. Like, you have Sandor saying, "I killed my first man at 12." Like that's in like chapter 7. So yeah, you have that sentiment expressed pretty early in the story. Beer, first time drinking beer or wine, first time having it, and first time having too much. Those are both formative moments, probably. John Ravenscroft points out Robb and Theon taking Bran out on his new saddle, which makes you think of your first horse ride, your first horseback ride, and maybe certain sub milestones alongside that. Yeah, first time riding by yourself, maybe first time like jumping something, first time racing a horse versus just trotting on it.
Yeah, I was gonna say the first time you gallop a horse, maybe that might be maybe even similar to. I think you're gonna bring this up in a minute, but to getting a driver's license, because it's one thing to like have driven a car in the parking lot at 7 miles an hour. This is the brake pedal, but it's another thing to like get onto the highway. You know what I mean? To like. So and I think
and you're allowed your first time doing that. Yeah, it's probably a big deal.
Yeah.
Or first time in traffic, your first time, like, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Galloping a horse is no joke. That's a little different than just having someone help you up on the saddle and hold the reins, trot around in a circle. But to like take off with a horse sprinting is scary and dangerous, and you've got to have a certain amount of experience and expertise and bravery or whatever. Yeah. I could easily see that as a standard for quote unquote manhood.
I like that. Yeah, it's a good comp there, totally. Because it's something you build up too slowly. You can't just hit the ground galloping.
Yeah,
exactly. So Megan Edwards has a really good take on here. Her post said the first time, and this is coming from a mother's perspective. She says, first time navigating a tough situation on your own. Whatever that tough situation may be, without help, in other words. Like, that's the on your own part that she's keying in on is really important. Like, it could be handling your fear while riding a horse fast for the first time. Maybe that's, you're at that point, you kind of are on your own. No one else can manage your fear for you. They might be able to give you some words of encouragement, but ultimately that's coming from within, both the fear and your ability to manage it. First time reading a book, first time writing a letter, things like that, those would maybe be a little more important or momentous in a subliterate society, right? But it's still a pretty big deal in a literate society. The first time you like read complete a book on your own for the first time. What about a first?
Yeah, that might be a good milestone, but maybe not a milestone for becoming a man. Like, at least not in modern times. Maybe back then, because it might have been more rare and special. There just weren't children's books.
Yeah.
Because I think like a 5-year-old kid might read a book nowadays.
Well, there's a caution for young girls. That's no. Children's book. No, it's not a children's book. Definitely not a children's book. So first job is an interesting one to try to compare. Now that one doesn't really apply to lords, high lords, but you could make a comparison to like their first time having experience as a page or squire. That's kind of like a job.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
For someone of a lower class, like middle class equivalent would be like an apprenticeship in this setting, where you're pretty much 9 to 5ing some tedious thing that's hopefully teaching you a skill that will have more value later in life. As a blacksmith's apprentice, to bring up one that we see on page with Gendry. So that's a good example. I suppose the equivalent, it's been said before, to a tournament is sporting events. So your first sporting event, especially participating in one, that would be more of a milestone than just seeing one. But seeing one is a pretty big deal too. Like Sansa seeing that tournament for her, she was like, wow, she was so like blown away at everything and just thought it was amazing and wanted it to be perfect. And that had a big impact on her because she saw things she didn't expect to see, was told stories it wasn't as pretty as she thought it would be. There was real blood and people yelling at each other, and it almost got worse. And yeah, I mean, that changed her view on tournaments forever. So that was the Sansification.
That's when she became a real woman.
She saw a knight die in a tournament. Yeah. Tracy M says, in Scotland, boys have to strip to the waist and pummel each other with 8-pound haggises to become a man. Wait, is that the plural for haggises? It's not haggai or... Yeah.
What's a haggis? I don't even know what
Haggis.
that is.
Haggis is a stuffed. It's like an intestine stuffed. It's like a sausage, kind of. I think.
Okay.
It's sort of. It's like
8
a type
pounds
of
it, huh?
Yeah.
All boys in Scotland have to do
All.
this? Still have to do this?
Okay. I don't know about that.
And Tommy Pappas says for his children, his sons, he has 2, right? They're very young. To him, it will be a milestone when they complete a task meant to be done with their hands, with their feet instead. Like that's when you really if you can like turn the bathtub on and off with your feet instead of your hands, or I don't know, even something more fancy like shaving.
Shaving.
Shaving with your feet. Yeah, I don't know about how you do that, but I guess I'm not a man because I've never shaved with my feet. So, damn it.
I've got one. How about the first time you witnessed the Queen having sex with her brother?
Whoa. Yeah, I don't know if Ned had that one in his upbringing, but yeah, Bran certainly did. Yes. Wow. Good one, Sean. Good one. Dornish James says, have always thought the lack of a heart tree at the Eyrie was a huge part of why Ned allowed a sept to be built for Cat at Winterfell. Ooh, good point. Yeah, because he didn't have his way to worship unless maybe he was elsewhere in the Vale. There may have been times where he was like at the Royce's place, and there would have been a heart tree there probably, but not at the Eyrie, which is a big deal. Yeah. Also, Dornish James says there was also the.
That's such a good call. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry, but yeah,
that
that's really good.
Yeah, great. Good said, Dornish Dame. And they also say there was also the guilt over Jon and Lyanna and the lies he was having to tell, but I think his inability to honor his own religion in the Eyrie made him consider building one. Yeah, he knew what it was like to not be able to worship the way he wanted, and felt and had that in turn had that sympathy for Catelyn. Or at least anticipated it. She may have never. You wonder if she asked for it or was like, "Where will I worship?" And he's like, the bells went off in his head. He's like, "Oh, I'll build you a sept. We can't. You know, it's unacceptable to not have a place to worship. Let me tell you." So, Kirsty Angel asks, "What exactly is a quote warden of North, East, South, and West?" 4 titles that were created by Aegon the Conqueror upon taking the throne. He wanted to assign responsibility for foreign invasions to an arbitrary distinction of 4 locations throughout, and it's called warden because a warden is usually someone who is in charge of a prison. I don't know why the term warden is used here, but I think warden has.
I think of warden as being someone. I can't think of the exact word. It's one word, it's synonym, but like protector, the one who is responsible for. And so often there's a warden of a prison, but you could be a warden of other things too.
Yeah.
And
Maybe the hospital warden, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that, and it probably was primarily Aerys' intent was from foreign invasion, but I think a warden would be responsible for interior stuff too, like repairing a bridge or a squabble between 2 lords under them. But especially making it north, south, east, west. The west is probably trying to defend against the freaking Iron Islanders. The north is protecting the wall. The south at the time maybe was protecting against Dorne, and so on some level, it's probably just a way to set up sort of a hierarchy, so the king doesn't have to worry about some squabble with some lower lords or 13 wildlings came across the wall. The Warden of North will take care of that.
Yeah,
don't
absolutely.
come to me with that. But also, I'm sure it was at least partly a political move to make them feel more important, to make them,
to create
sort of
squabbling and jockeying for position. Kind of like what we talked about in the High Garden episode. They created all these noble orders and tournaments and things that they would want to compete over rather than competing with them for the lordship. And it makes all that just makes their authority even stronger. Yeah. Dornish Dame, another comment, quote, "No doubt he thinks a bit of beard makes him a man. Dunk had thought the same when he first found some fuzz growing in his upper lip. I tried to shave with my dagger and almost nicked my nose off." That's a good point. Your first facial hair as a boy is something that a lot of people take pride in or hope to take pride in or don't, But yeah, that is kind of a milestone that's pretty distinctly masculine. Now, Guilty Undertaker also says, among the Zulu, young men were painted white and sent away with just a spear and a shield. If they came back alive after the paint wore off, they were now men. Just go jump in a river. Real quick. I'm back. I was like, you were gone like 20 minutes, bro. Like, how did that? It was windy. I don't know. No, that's pretty cool, though. I love hearing these other examples of what it takes to be a man, because there's broad differences amongst cultures. They usually involve similar things: surviving, bravery, showing competence. But it's competence in the things that matter to your culture or your tribe, which often are martial in origin or related to things like that, like hunting, which is a martial pursuit, but also one that you need to live. At least some cultures, most cultures. Also, a comment from Kat Ovivas from a couple weeks ago in reference to Shiera Seastar. This could have a little bit of relevance to, say, Lyanna and maybe even Lyarra Stark. We don't know how she died, but it's possible it was childbed. Now, she says, we were wondering whether Shiera's mother could have named her even after, apart from having chosen out a name before pregnancy, which is, of course, always a possibility. But she says, as an obstetrician, so we should absolutely listen and take this opinion very strongly. She says, most maternal deaths in childbed occur after giving birth, not during. The most common cause being severe bleeding after the expulsion of the placenta. And this can happen even hours after the birth of the baby, and childbed fever can start several days later. Not that it always does, but it can start several days later. So yeah, there's a pretty wide window for dying from childbirth. It doesn't have to happen immediately or during. So absolutely a name can be picked out in that window, which apparently can be days long. So even if it's only hours long, in the case of, I'm forgetting her name, Shiera's mother, and
Serene.
Serene of Serene, a star of the sea. Yeah, Serene of Lys could have picked the name out, even if it was only a couple hours, as long as she was conscious. Nina points out an example from history that is one relevant to us because we talk about this time period a lot. Henry VIII, his wife Jane Seymour, who was his third wife, died 12 days after giving birth to Edward. Postpartum infection and or pulmonary embolism. So, yeah. All right. Let's talk about Ned's time in the Vale. This was more of it. These years were in some ways more formative, maybe not emotionally. Maybe those earlier years had more to do with his emotional upbringing. But in terms of things he learned how to do and things that were memorable to him later in life distinctly, well, of course, those your years are more, there's less fog around your later years because they're less distant, they're more memorable, etc. Barbary Dustin says her father, Roderick Riswell, wanted her to marry either Brandon or Ned. And again, as we said earlier, there may have been circumstances that could have happened, but probably not. So, Lord Rickard was probably dead set on these southern marriages. That's why I said the circumstances would have to be a lot different for him not to think that way, I guess. I mean, part of the reason to send Ned to the south was to prepare him for a southern marriage, and also to, in addition to shoring up that alliance with Jon Arryn and the Tullys, etc. Lady Dustin claims it was Rickard's Maester Wallace who suggested both the Cat Brandon and Robert Lyanna marriages, which is, I don't know about that. Barbary's got a real prejudice against Maesters, and it doesn't, the logic here doesn't really work. Ned, although logistics maybe don't really work. Logistics, yeah, similar. Because Ned comes back from the Vale carrying that marriage offer for Lyanna, for his father to consider, Robert to Lyanna. It doesn't sound like the idea came from Maester Wallace if Ned comes home with that offer from the Vale, right, while hanging out with Robert all the time. That sounds like, I mean, yeah, maybe they sent some birds back and forth and then they decided to do it formally. But why would Ned need to bring, I don't understand why they couldn't just send that message. Yeah, so it doesn't sound like that came from Wallace, unless it would have to be like he sends a message without Rickard's knowledge to, I don't know about that. Nina also says, yeah, anything Barbary Dustin says should be taken with a grain of salt. She's got specific grievances, and she's trying to sell a narrative to Theon that she hopes filters back to Roose, because she wants Theon to tell Roose certain things, and to Roose to believe certain things, and to be sure of certain things about her loyalty. So yeah, she's got a lot of reasons to lie. And she's bitter, and she's been bitter for a long time, which isn't the best thing for managing your biases and kind of centering yourself. So, yeah. I mean, basically, when she says, I could have married, Brandon or Ned, but Catelyn got that one too. Like, she's blaming her for it. Like, that's not Catelyn's fault. So, yeah, those kind of phrases like that remind us of her extreme bias here. But she might be, it's possible she's right. But how would she have known it was Maester Wallace's idea? She was like a teenager at the time. Like, where is her information even coming from on this? Like, does this 15-year-old Barbary Dustin have a spy inside Winterfell? I don't think so. You know. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she may genuinely believe it. It might not purely be a bias or a lie, but it still might not be true. She still might have been fed false information, or
Yeah.
concluded it in her mind, and it makes sense to her, especially with her biases. But yeah, it's dubious.
So Ned, 8 years old, even though it sounds really young, it's fairly normal. If you're going to be fostered, that's a normal time for it to start. It's just really difficult to think about that. It's like when I was 8, I got sent away to summer camp, which was a huge deal, but that was 3 months, Like I was like, wow, I was away from my house for 3 months. That's huge. Probably thinking back on it, I was like, my mom really needed that break. But at the time, that stuff didn't occur to me. But this is a totally different scenario. Like, that's the closest I can get to it, and it's not that close. We're talking 8 years, not 3 months. I mean, this is your entire, like, childhood education, basically, minus a few years.
It's also just another little side note. A lot of times when I was envisioning Brandon and Ned competing as brothers, I was imagining it kind of like Rob and Jon. I was imagining like teenage boys, but they would have been 6 or 7. I suppose that Ned wasn't just permanently gone. They probably came back like for the summer or something.
Well,
right? They probably saw
16.
each other.
Not till he was 16. That's what they say. Is like once he turned 16, he started to go back and forth, which is also
really. So he was just gone the whole time.
There may be an exception or two, but they weren't regular visits back home apparently, which is a little surprising. But apparently that's just how they do it. Like Nina gives a couple of similar outstanding examples. She says Harmon the Second Whore, who was fostered with the King of the Rock. That's an Ironborn fostering with the King of the Rock is unusual. Roland the First Arryn, who fostered with the King of the Riverlands. A little less unusual. It's still unusual because these are separate kingdoms at the time. These aren't houses under the Iron Throne that are working together. These are separate realms at that time. Nina says, in both cases, these fosterlings specifically encouraged the men fostered to align themselves politically, socially, and or culturally with the places they were fostered. Harmond by continuing his father's promotion of pro-mainland reforms. Like, Harmond was, like, the Hoare family was more about mainland domination than about being traditional Ironborn. Remember, they're the ones who built Harrenhal and all that, well, eventually. And that they were different for Ironborn. They were more progressive for Ironborn, you could say. And Roland by taking inspiration from the grand ancestral castles across Westeros by taking the seat for the Arryn. So in this case, we're talking really long ago. This is the same Roland who built the Eyrie after looking at Highgarden and Castle Rock and going, what are we, scrubs? Yeah. So Lord Rickard had arrangements for a marriage to Riverrun, a fostering in the Vale, and eventually a marriage to Storm's End. Those were his 3 big plays. Maybe he had plans for Benjen too. Just because Benjen eventually joined the Night's Watch, that doesn't mean that was what his original plan for him was. That sounds like something that developed later because of all the other stuff, the war and all the deaths. So, but I would strongly suspect that Rickard would have married Benjen to another southern family had things gone differently. And it's safe to say these arrangements were not sudden. They were made years in advance, or at least a year in advance. The planning may have started even before that without choosing specific people. Like, well, we could maybe choose one of these 3 houses, one of these 4 houses. Similar for Robert, we can presume. And we wonder if they were specifically, like, did they arrange this specifically, having a Stark and a Baratheon being fostered at the Vale? Was that intentional? That specific arrangement, or just kind of work out there? It's like, yeah, I'm going to send my kid to the Vale, and so is Robert Baratheon's going to foster there too. Oh, okay, cool. Or did they plan that specifically? Like, we're going to have these 2 be at the same place at the same time. Consider, in setting up this subtopic discussion here, that the reason Bran went to King's Landing, or was going to go to King's Landing before his fall, was because Ned perceived ill will between Robb and Joffrey. And was like, Bran will help bridge the gap between those 2 because of his personality. So, yeah, there may have been thinking, kind of like how families think about arranged marriages and consider the personalities of the people they're going to have married. Sometimes they don't in cases like this, but sometimes they do. And this may have been one of those times where they're like trying to place the right boys together that they think would have the right results. They would form friendships or look out for each other. Yeah, it's entirely possible.
I wondered a little bit about that too. Why part of it, I imagine, was it Jon Arryn didn't have a son of his own, or any kids even, right?
At that point,
So,
his brother's son was his heir. At that point, yeah.
So maybe it's convenient, I guess, for him to take on wards, but I don't know how much he wanted that, or that was coordinated. Was it Arryn pushing to get these boys
May have been
to be,
yeah.
or like, why didn't they send Ned to Storm's Inn to be fostered with or why didn't Robert go all the way to Winterfell?
I guess it made sense to find this central location, the one that kind of is like the better between point.
But like the idea that maybe the Eyrie is like a little closer to home. Well, it doesn't matter if you didn't go home for 8 years anyway. That didn't seem to be a factor. So,
well, I guess it matters in terms of their kingdoms being next to each other, right? That part perhaps matters in terms of the future of their potential wars.
Maybe that alliance is more important to foster, I suppose. And the Eyrie is connected to both of them. And,
I mean, there is a history of not a recent history, but there was a long history of the Vale and the North fighting. Remember, they fought the worthless war over the sisters, and not that they had any sort of recent flare-up of hostilities that we know about, but you don't take chances. Friendship between the Vale and the North is good for everyone, pretty much.
This thing that we know has happened in the past is less likely to happen in the future if we take this action. The
reason it didn't happen in the past is because of actions like this. Let's continue to do that. Yeah, I totally agree. Except that it wasn't done in this way because we don't have a lot of Northerners fostered in the South. So this was maybe a different way to do it. Maybe they didn't realize the potential downsides of it, which was these entangling friendships. Although, we think the friendships kind of worked out because we didn't want Aerys to win Robert's Rebellion, did we? So I don't know. It's a little tricky when you really break it down like that. Nina totally agrees that this was very likely arranged specifically, certain personalities put in certain places, certain members of certain houses. She says Jon Arryn had the mature statesmanship, but no children to use for marital alliance of his own. Hoster Tully had 2 eligible daughters, but his son was too young yet to educate for leadership as Brandon, Robert, and to a lesser extent Ned could be. And while Robert was perfectly poised for that sort of education, his father might have seemed too naturally pro-Targaryen to be useful as an immediate ally. Consider that the Baratheons are Targaryen descendants, and not just from the ancient past. Remember, Robert and Stannis and Renly descend from Rhaella Targaryen, Egg's daughter, or sister, rather. So that's not that many generations back. What is it, 2 generations, 3 generations back? So you could see why they'd be maybe like, well, we want them on our side because we don't want them on the Targaryen side, but you can't just assume that they won't side with their, the old guard because that's where they come from. So you want to lock that up. So you can see the logic behind making sure the Baratheons are included, but you don't want to give them the hostages. To answer your earlier question, maybe that might be the especially because in this era, remember Steffon Baratheon went looking for a wife for Rhaegar. He went searching the South and then died on the way home. Yeah, it was always a little suspicious. They couldn't find anyone at all, but which might key into some of the might be part of this whole arraigning and conspiracy stuff, but not part of this episode. But still interesting to think about. So, by the way, there were phrases that Walder wanted some of his children or grandchildren to be included in this fostering of Robert and Ned, and they were like, no. No. So, which just further fuels...
You can't sit with us.
Yeah, you can't sit with us, which further fuels Walder's, like, they're always looking down on me, Some of his revenge later. This was one of his many grievances. So Ned, this is pretty interesting. Ned goes from training and growing up with his brother Brandon, who's bigger and stronger than him, and only 1 year older, to growing up and training with Robert, who's also even bigger and stronger, and also exactly 1 year older. So it's like it's like a swap-in of a foster brother for his real brother, who's the same age, and also just like bigger and stronger. Even if they were the same age, Robert would be a lot bigger than Ned. So yeah. And Jon Arryn becomes like a second father to both of them. At this time, they both have their real father still alive, but given a few more years pass, 8, I guess, both of their fathers will be dead. Both Rickard and Steffon will die well prematurely, not from natural causes. And that presumably is something they both bond over during this point, because they would be together when word of that happened. Well, Robert wouldn't. Robert saw his parents die, so he would come back from Storm's End and Ned would grieve with him. But when Ned's parents were killed, or Ned's father was killed and brother, they got word of that at the Vale. And yeah, that would have been quite a thing. We'll come back to that in a minute. But just the reaction would have been a big deal from a lot of people. So this is a question we got while setting this episode up. What would Ned's duties have been in the Vale? Like, we know he would have been learning things. What about like his responsibilities? This is where we talk about the difference between a squire as a title and a squire as a set of duties. Because you can be a squire without having the title of squire. Squire can be a verb, it can also be a title. So Ned was a squire in the sense that he did the duties of a squire, but he wasn't a squire in the sense that he was on track to knighthood. He could have been. Jorah got knighted. So it's entirely possible that they asked him, like, do you want to be a knight? Is that how you wanted to go? And Ned declined. Because he probably got that offer. They probably were like, no, Ned, you're not worthy of being a knight. Yeah, right. Please. Of course he was worthy of being a knight. This is Ned Stark we're talking about. Jon Arryn raised him. Of course he's worthy. So the offer probably came and he probably declined. Or maybe his father was like, nah. But I bet it was his call. I bet it was his personal call. He was like, no thanks. I want to be a northerner. Which is pretty interesting.
He still might have made that personal call because his dad poo-pooed it. He might have been like, they're probably going to try to make you a knight. Don't fall for it, Yeah. So there's probably some biases.
Remember where you came from, son. Like that kind of topic. Like, yeah, you're going to the South. You're representing us here. So don't let them change you. Like a nicer version of Balon and Theon. It's like, oh, those Starks got their claws in you and you're no longer a squid. You're no longer a kraken. You're some wolf now. Did you pay the iron price for that necklace? Things like that. It's like, oh, you're a knight, huh, Ned? Look at you, all fancy Southerner. Yeah. So, yeah, I think there was something to that. Yeah. But again, he would have the same job, like saddling horses, sharpening swords, all that stuff. It's the same job, even if he doesn't become.
Brienne's not a knight, but she's a knight.
Yeah,
absolutely. She's what a knight is supposed to be. Ned was probably what a knight is supposed to be, even if he didn't have the official technical title.
Yeah, and Brienne squired for Renly without being his squire or a squire at all. Daemon Sand squired for Oberyn before his fight with the Mountain, but Daemon's already a knight at that point. So you can be a squire without being a squire. Like Nina says, Terrence Linderley and Giles Grafton were referred to as Robert Arryn squires. Robert is 6 years old. Like he doesn't have need for squires yet. So it's just it's an honorific. Like Varys being called a lord when he's not really a lord of anything. He's just on the small council. So it's a similar thing. Like the terms are used loosely. So yeah, as you alluded to before, Jon's heir at this time, his heir in this era was Elbert Arryn. Yeah, it was word. It just keeps coming up. Heir.
Yeah, I know. Arryn.
Era. He'd have likely been around a lot. Elbert would have been. So he would have probably a lot older than Robert and Ned, but they would have known him. And that's, like I said, Jon's nephew. Nina's like, I don't know how much older I tend to think Elbert was. We have absolutely no sense on Ronald Arryn's age relative to Jon. Ronald being Jon's younger brother who had passed by this time, else Ronald himself would have been the heir before Elbert. But we don't. Yeah, so we have no idea like Elbert's age relative to his own father, let alone Ronald's age relative to Jon. So So Brandon had Elbert as a companion. So he probably wouldn't have been Brandon's companion if he had been a lot older. Brandon's companions were probably around his age. That's a good point by Nina. I was kind of guessing Elbert was probably older, but this argues for him being a little younger. And being Brandon's companion, however, didn't have a happy ending because, as we know, all of Brandon's companions were executed alongside him. So, which frames the later discussion about Jon Arryn's reaction to Robert and Ned's heads being called for when already one of his own heir was already executed by that brouhaha. So he could have been older than Brandon and Ned, but probably wasn't really. He probably wasn't a lot older than them because of Brandon's companions. Yeah, they're like his buddies. And this is also the time when Jon wasn't even married at this point. So probably. Very lonely household, as we're thinking about Rickard's household becoming lonely and eventually Ned's. This would all be something maybe Ned noticed when he was around. He noticed that Jon, his own family, part of why they grew so close was Jon's didn't have his own family to spend some time with. That would have maybe some of that energy would have been poured elsewhere, but it was all poured into Robert and Ned and maybe a couple others if they were around, some unnamed other maybe Fosters that were there, but maybe not, maybe just those two. After all, they excluded the phrase. I mean, not a lot of other candidates to be there. Now, there would have been other knights and people around who were Valemen, but I'm talking about fosters to Jon Arryn specifically. So Nina says basically they're kind of replacing the children who normally would, the Arryn children who normally would have been there. They would have had Arryn children, there should always be some Arryn children, but there weren't at this time because Robert Arryn, of course, came much later. At some point, Robert would have started showing the negative qualities. I mean, he had a lot of positive qualities too, but at some point, the negative qualities that became big problems would have started to appear. Drinking, lots of chasing women, all that stuff. It sounds like Brandon was doing some of the same, though not at age 9 when Ned left for the Vale. But still, that would have probably been in the back of Ned's head, seeing how similar his brother and Robert were in a lot of ways in terms of these qualities. And maybe that's part of why Ned was so disciplined in that, because he saw that weakness in some of his elder brothers and foster brothers, and was like, I do not want to be like that. For whatever reason, he had to be more disciplined. Perhaps it's second son mentality. Well, this is a weakness of theirs. This is a way I can get ahead by being disciplined and stronger than they are, and something like that. I can't afford to take these liberties because I'm the second son. That sort of mentality. A lot of possibilities, but they all seem to at least potentially fit with Ned's personality. Coming back to the idea of tournaments, Ian Nurse wants to know if we think Ned participated in them at all, since it is popular in the Vale and he would have been encouraged to. Now, he's not interested in them later in life, but that doesn't mean he didn't give them a try when he was young. Someone like Robert would have been all about it and may have encouraged Ned to do it with him, because they're like, come on, Ned, you're my friend, let's joust together, things like that. And Robert wasn't some great jouster, so like Ned might have actually been decently matched against him. Nina says, yeah, it's hard to believe that Ned wasn't at least bare minimum trained to do tourney stuff. After all, Brandon was good at it because of his upbringing at riding horses, and even Lyanna apparently had some skills there also because of her horse riding skill. So he would have participated not because of glory or acclaim, which is why he would have avoided it later in life, because that would have been the only point as an adult. But he wanted to, like a lot of things, he wanted to represent the North and his house well. It would be a point of, he's a Stark in the South. He wants to conduct himself well and not have people laugh at him, not have their house be shamed for any reason. And that's not really going to happen by sitting out. If all the boys are participating in some sort of contest, some sort of championship, some sort of competition, he's going to want to compete just because it's expected of him. And Ned, I don't think isn't the type of person to shun that kind of thing when it's a responsibility. If he sees it as a duty or responsibility, he's unlikely to pass. He's like, well, yeah, I got to do this.
Here's another nature versus nurture dynamic here. In studies, there's all sorts of studies that have been done on this, and a lot of them are like on twins that were separated at birth, or families that have an adopted child, and just comparing how they interact, and to give some idea of how much of it is this family environment or social structure they're being raised in versus the genetics that they had, And one thing they found when they do these types of studies is that the nurture side of things tend to be stronger in the youth. Like when you're 15 and you're surrounded by parents and teachers and stuff, you tend to display more of those influences than when you're 45.
Okay.
And you've moved away from that, and your own ostensibly inherited genetic personality definers have taken more control of your life than all the nurture you were getting in your youth. So Ned going from age 8 to age 16 at the Vale with the Knights and Robert and the tournaments, he's way more likely to have been affected by all that and gone along and done it. Flash forward 20 years, when he's more removed from that and his more natural personality is dominating more so than the nurture of his youth, he might completely disregard tournaments. No way to know if this is actually the case, but it's adds to my belief that heck yeah, he was definitely in tournaments.
Yeah, and you're right. That's a great point. Also, one more thing I'll add to it is to say, and also he just wouldn't understand the consequences of it as well. So some of the things he doesn't like about it is it's just like a big waste of money, which as a 12-year-old he may not have thought about that. It may not have been clear to him like, oh man, this costs a lot. It's better to save this money for winter supplies. Like when he's in charge of things and thinking on that level, he's like, yeah, we don't. This is a big waste, you know.
Never mind injury. You might tear your ACL playing in a tournament.
Oh my God, Sean.
I meant to bring that up at the beginning, by the way, y'all. Both of my co-hosts today have injured legs. We got.
Yeah, I don't know if you knew that, Sean. I sprained my ankle yesterday, Sean.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I
goodness.
wrapped
fell
up
at
with
the
ice and
zoo.
everything.
Oh,
Yeah,
all
so I
places to fall.
was in the middle. I'm actually in the middle of rewrapping my ankle right now. But yeah, anyways, not nearly as bad as Sean's tumble at the tournament.
So you're having surgery
No tourneys.
soon, right, Saron?
Yeah, in 10 days, I'm gonna.
Sean has surgery on his birthday.
Everybody wish Sean a happy surgery birthday. So, who else this is kind of a question for everyone, just something to think about. Who else was around the Vale these years for Ned to have been influenced by or befriended? Ned's grandfather's grandfather married Laura Royce, as we said back early in the episode, and his mother descends from a separate Stark branch that also comes through Laura Royce, as we said. So he's a distant relative to the Royces on both sides, which would probably be a point of contact with one of the primary houses in the Vale, the Royces. And Bronze Jon Royce is a friend to Ned later. And we're not sure how old Bronze Jon Royce is. He's a little bit older, it seems like, but maybe not a lot older. And there was someone named Kyle Royce murdered by Aerys alongside Ned's family. So this Kyle guy was probably known to Ned, maybe even a friend. He was in Brandon's retinue, Kyle Royce, which was why he was killed. So he was probably around Brandon's age, using the same logic we used for Elbert Arryn, which might mean he was Bronze Jon's younger brother. But either way, a Royce with some connection to Bronze Jon, because these were both Royces, so obviously he had a reason to be on the side he was on. Probably connection, yeah. And it was the Royces did help right away. When the war broke out, the Royces were alongside, we assume, Jon and Robert and Ned when they took Gulltown, because the Gulltown rose for the Targaryens. And Jon Royce would later be, quote, close to open revolt over Lysa's unwillingness to support the Starks versus the Lannisters at the beginning of the War of Five Kings. So there's a lot of reasons to look at this connection between Royce and Stark and think that a lot of it came from Ned's youth, or at least was reinforced. Old connections were reinforced by Ned's youth, might be a better way to put it. But either way, Ned's youth and time in the Vale seems to be pretty crucial. Nina writes, Ned remembers Robert jesting with Lord Hunter and Jon Arryn right before the moment Rhaegar presented the crown of the Queen in Love and Beauty to Lyanna. That's, of course, at the Tournament of Harrenhal. While Lord Hunter was considerably older than Ned or Robert, either or both of his two younger sons might have been of an age with Robert and Ned. So the Hunters, obviously that's a Vale house. We see them amongst those Lords Declarant with Littlefinger and A Feast for Crows. Or against Littlefinger and A Feast for Crows, but also with Littlefinger. And so the Hunters would have been another potential family that would have been around Robert and Ned and had solid relations of that era. And Ned might have even known Harold Harding's parents. That'd be a funny little twist of a little connection that we might not have seen coming. That did not occur to me at all. Good catch by Nina. With Jon Arryn as his foster father, Ned might have been encouraged to see Alice Arryn, Jon's sister, as something like an aunt to him. Makes sense. Especially since Ned himself had no aunts or uncles on his father's side and only a single aunt married to a Stormlands aristocrat on his mother's side. So he probably didn't know her very well at all. Some or all of Alice's daughters might have been of an age with Ned and Robert, and while the boys might have grown less close to these girls as they aged, and, Westerosi gender divisions are what they are, their paths tend to really diverge. They keep the young boys and young girls away from each other during their educational upbringing years quite often. And so they might have still visited, though, despite that. They may have visited these foster quote-unquote cousins. And Harry's father was a knight sworn to Iron Oaks, so that's another prominent Vale house. So, yeah, there's a lot of that may have a little backdoor connection. Here's a passage that really helps us cast our imagination back to this time. This is Eddard 7, A Game of Thrones.
They broke their fast on black bread and boiled goose eggs and fish fried up with onions and bacon at a trestle table by the river's edge. The king's melancholy melted away with the morning mist, and before long Robert was eating an orange and waxing fond about a morning at the Eyrie when they had been boys.
Had given Jon a barrel of oranges, remember? Only the things had gone rotten, so I flung mine across the table and hit Dax right in the nose. You remember Redfort's pock-faced squire? He tossed one back at me, and before Jon could so much as fart, there were oranges flying across the high hall in every direction.
He laughed uproariously, and even Ned smiled, remembering. This was the boy he had grown up with, he thought. This was the Robert Baratheon he'd known and loved.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good quote. I like that. Now, House Redfort is pretty much in between Runestone and the Eyrie, so it makes sense that the Redforts would be present there. And we wonder, too, this brings up another question. This is maybe a little too big for this episode, but Domeric Bolton squired for Lord Redfort. So you see this, like, Rickard Stark, not the only Northern Lord, looking south to make different arrangements. And maybe that's why the Boltons did it. They wanted to just do what the Starks of Winterfell were doing, just play along, make the same sort of parallel moves. And hey, if they're going to get involved in the south, so are we. We're going to reap the same benefits they do. Maybe use this to our advantage somehow. Yeah.
You know, I read this quote. I'm not sure how to read this quote. I see a different interpretation than what I had before. I've always had felt like it was Ned fondly reflecting on Robert of youth. You know, like this nostalgic thing, like, oh man, that's the Robert I knew. But now I think maybe he's seeing the signs. He's like, yeah, Robert's always been this jerk, this violent, aggressive, inconsiderate, destructive, immature, etc., you know?
Yeah, started a food fight. I mean, that's pretty, yeah. He started now he's starting food wars, not food fights.
Like, the idea is like kind of fun. He started a food fight. Can you imagine if a strong teenage boy threw an orange and hit you in the nose? That's not just like light horseplay. That could seriously at least hurt. Maybe not permanently injure.
Yeah, for people who were wailing on each other in the practice yard, that's probably not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
But still, like it's kind of like, well, I mean, Arya threw an orange at Sansa, remember, and ruined her dress.
Yeah.
But yeah, Arya can't throw like Robert. Yeah, like she can't throw. She might have to be more accurate, but she can't load up like 6'3" Robert. Yeah, that probably hurt. Yeah. And it stings. It's like, oh man, that really hurt, man, dude.
And again, it's like, haha, that was so fun. Slaves, come clean up our mess. We're done having fun now. Yeah. Come on, all the people that have no control of their lives, clean up the mess we had for fun. You know, that's the result of that.
So let's talk about Jon Arryn, because he's like this second father figure. He's come up so much. He's really important. Let's focus on him for at least a few minutes, starting with this quote that, well, it sets up how big a deal Jon was to Ned.
There is no way to soften the blow, so she told him straight. I am so sorry, my love. Jon Arryn is dead. His eyes found hers, and she could see how hard it took him, as she had known it would. In his youth, Ned had fostered at the Eyrie, and the childless Lord Arryn had become a second father to him and his fellow ward, Robert Baratheon. When the Mad King, Aerys II Targaryen, had demanded their heads, the Lord of the Eyrie had raised his moon and falcon banners in revolt rather than give up those he had pledged to protect.
So as we can see here, he lived with Jon Arryn as long as he lived in Winterfell. That's 8 years each, right? Or close enough. And as I said, Sean, when you brought it up earlier, then once he turned 16, he started going back and forth quite a bit until the war broke out. So that was about 3 years of going back and forth before Robert's Rebellion. So we actually have a clearer picture of Jon's personality than Rickard's. Not only is Jon arguably a bigger influence on Ned, but we know more about Jon. So much of Ned's nobility, his honor, his decency seems to come from Jon. Maybe it was reinforced by some of those qualities also being present in his own father. So like that would be a really strong influence if both Rickard and Jon had those qualities, which is entirely possible they did, given how well Jon and Rickard seemed to hit it off, or at least agree on a lot of things. At least they worked together functionally as allies, which implies a level of trust, which may imply certain common traits amongst their personality. Like if Rickard was a real scumbag, Jon wouldn't have trusted him, or if he was untrustworthy. He wouldn't trust an untrustworthy person, I guess, right? And later, Kat points out in her very first chapter that Ned's father figure became a brother by marriage when they both married Tully's sisters. So it's kind of like he was my second father, then he became my brother-in-law, which is it's a little weird, but it brought them even closer in a sense, you know, which is also weird that Ned married the older of the two girls when Jon is, never mind. Political marriages are weird. Ned says, or Nina says rather, Ned, Nina, not Ned. Nina says it's also worth considering what extra education and military command Ned might have gotten by virtue of being fostered with Jon Arryn versus Rickard Stark. We don't know exactly how much experience Jon Arryn had in war prior to the War of Ninepenny Kings, but given his age, it's possible that he served in not just that, but the Peak Uprising and the Fourth Blackfire Rebellion. Which is not to say Rickard was necessarily bad or uneducated, but I tend to think Rickard played it safe in the war because when Rickard Stark was in the War of Ninepenny Kings, we don't know of any other living Stark males. So it would be kind of dangerous for him to put himself in the front lines. He didn't have a son yet. The War of Ninepenny Kings was in 260. Brandon Stark was born in 262. And we don't know of any uncles. So, or brothers, or whatever. Uncle, well, either. So, we know of no other Stark males at that time. So that's a big deal.
That was also like on the far end of the continent too, right?
Yes, Melis the Monstrous was slain on the Stepstones. So yeah, the extreme far end. You're right. So basically, between Dorne and Essos. Yeah.
So like if he had just immediately abandoned all responsibility and taken off as fast as he could with no support or anything, it still would have taken like months to get there. You know. And if he needed to tie some stuff up and get, a company together and they're traveling on a road with a bunch of horses and wagons, it might have taken a literal year to get down there to do anything. So
and you wonder how he handled the whole "there must be a Stark in Winterfell." Like what did they do? Maybe he didn't go at all. Maybe he just sent a subordinate and just. But that doesn't make sense because of the befriending people. So he may have gone in a command role and just never got close to fighting directly. But maybe he took the risk, or maybe there was an uncle or cousin that we're not aware of that was the Stark in Winterfell during that period. It's entirely possible that there's an unnamed Stark around. Wouldn't be a stretch at all. But this answers an earlier question we had about why was maybe Ned a better battle commander than Brandon? Not just potentially because of just he was more suited for it, but because Ned learned from someone who likely had more experience at it. Yeah. We also hear later that Jon Arryn was a mitigating factor between Ned's ice and Robert's fire. When Ned and Robert fight over the dead Targaryen children in King's Landing, right after Rhaegar's death and the sack of King's Landing, Robert says, "I see no babes, only dragon spawn," and Ned loses it at that comment. And the next line is not even Jon Arryn had been able to calm that storm. So that was an interesting role reversal. That's Robert being ice and Ned being fire. Right? I'd actually
that's a good call.
Noticed that. And although it's written as a storm, but same difference, like fiery storm, whatever. Firestorm in Ned's case. So, but I'd say, so Jon was the go-between there that would somehow like help them mitigate their differences, which probably came up when they were younger. They would occasionally clash over things, and Jon was probably the one to say, "Hey, look, you guys are friends. Remember that." Like a father should do. That's a good fatherly thing to help build bridges between people when they're having disagreements and make sure those disagreements don't wreck their relationship for no good reason. It's doubtful they had bigger fights than that particular one, though. I mean, the one over the no babes, only dragon spawn. I'm not sure they had a reason to have a bigger argument than that. But still, I have a confident headcanon that Jon helped them resolve many differences over the years. That may have been the biggest one. And taught them lessons on how to do it on their own when he wasn't there. Which we do see happen. We do see some decent conflict resolution between them. Here's a quote that seemingly harkens. Oh, first, Sean has something to say.
Just thinking about the idea of how big that argument was, or if they had bigger ones. That one was. I mean, there's more at stake with that one than other arguments they'd had, but I can imagine as teenage boys, they argued harder over things that were less relevant.
Yeah,
that makes
that's
sense.
just how it is. Yeah, you got that verb.
Yeah.
You got that you want to win, you want to be right. Yeah, like stuff that doesn't matter quite as much when you're older.
There might not have been something right. There might not have been something that was actually as important as this for Jon to have to calm between them. But I can imagine Jon had to do more to calm between them than what was required. Like even in this, as much as upset as they were, it didn't come to blows. But I can imagine when they're 15 arguing over a girl, they might start wrestling around over the girl, wrestling around on the ground, or physically, coming to it.
So here's, like I said, here's a quote that harkens to this concept that we're discussing now.
For a moment, Ned did not follow. He'd run out of words, and he was filled with a vast sense of helplessness. Not for the first time, he wondered what he was doing here and why he had come. He was no Jon Arryn to curb the wildness of his king and teach him wisdom. Robert would do what he pleased, as he always had, and nothing Ned could say or do would change that.
That's a statement that comes from long years of experience dealing with this man, right? But he has the wisdom now to accept it. Before, he would have argued. Like you said, as a teenager, he probably would have argued, probably tried to get Robert not to do things. But this is a man who's had that argument so many times. Doesn't work. So he doesn't even do it. He's like, yeah, not only did Robert not do it before, now Robert's king. He's like, it's even harder. He's older. He's more set in his ways. He really, clearly.
He might have even in his youth been able to appeal to Jon, like, Jon, Robert's trying to do X, Y, Z. And sometimes Jon knows that Ned is right, but still tries to find middle ground or whatever else. But in this case, there's no one for him to appeal to. There's nowhere for him to go to and say, hey, the king's doing this wrong thing. Put him in check. Like, he's the one that's supposed to put the king in check, and he knows he can't do it.
And you can see how Ned's tries to somehow justify things that happen because of his loyalty to these people. You know, I'm not criticizing him too harshly here. You should be loyal to your friends to a certain degree, but these are also kings and lords, and their decisions affect a lot more than just their friendship here. Like when discussing finance, Robert spent all the crown's money, and Ned is like, surely Jon wouldn't have allowed that. And then he's like, dude, Robert does what he wants. You just got through thinking that 2 chapters ago. Like, oh yeah, good point, man. You know, he's just like, he didn't want to believe it. His default is to express loyalty to the thought processes of his friends and the people that he cares about. But when they say that, he's like, yeah, that checks out. You're like, yeah, Robert does what he wants. Like, yeah, okay. Yeah, I should have known that. You know, but he defaults to like loyalty, which is, I think that's an interesting thing. It's part of his upbringing. He goes back to, I was the younger one, so I should be supportive of their decisions as a default. Okay, you argued me into, they made a mistake. But he starts off with loyalty and being on their side.
And maybe even beyond loyalty, just his a lot of people, you have the instinct to kind of project what you would do onto other people.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't have spent all the crown's money, neither would Robert. I wouldn't have let Robert spend all the crown's money, neither would Jon. But, you know, when you stop to think about, like, everyone isn't going to do exactly what I would do. And I can't always do exactly what I want to do. So
yeah. And part of Ned's resentment towards Robert is that he did listen. Like, he did listen to these lessons. He did do what his superiors and authority figures and father figures told him. So some of that is like, second son mentality versus first son mentality expressed like writ large over the course of their lifetimes here. Old resentments coming back, but also old loyalties. He's still like, despite the stuff, it's still his friend, you know, like that doesn't fall off. Now, also Nina points out something that kind of segues into another subtopic here is being too trusting. Like, this isn't a good example. Ned was a little too trusting of his memory of Jon and Robert to put 2 and 2 together and think, oh, of course, Robert just did what he wanted. That's why they don't have money. I shouldn't have defaulted to thinking Jon would keep that under control. But there's more to it, isn't there? Part of the reason the crown's in debt is because of Baelish's schemes. And who appointed Baelish? Jon Arryn. Oops. So maybe being a little too trusting, that's where we come into this. Like, he hired this man and like just saw good results from what Littlefinger was doing, not realizing that this was manipulation, not realizing that this was financial scheming and all that. And that's probably something he learned from that. Maybe being a little too trusting, like Jon will later. I mean, Ned also will be too trusting of Littlefinger, even while he doesn't trust him. He's like, well, he was good to Cat. It's that same thing where he sees loyalty to someone he loves, and that makes him want to extend that same courtesy to the person that's doing it, even though often those people have ulterior motives, especially because of their people in power. Of course, it's a thing when you're in power, people will sidle up to you for favors because you're powerful. And Littlefinger is a master at that sort of thing.
And not to go on too much of a tangent, but it's possible that Robert or Jon allow more money to be spent than should have because Littlefinger made more money than they thought they could, right? Like it's
exactly
if Littlefinger is doing a bunch of positive things to free up more money, then Robert and or Jon are less worried about it and like, sure, go ahead and do that next tournament. But after the 3rd time of that, even Littlefinger's like, look, I can only do so much, you know?
Yeah. And Littlefinger kept getting promoted. He hired him, kept promoting him. And of course, that goes back to the War of Ninepenny Kings because Hoster Tully befriended Littlefinger's dad there, and Littlefinger got his appointment in part because of Jon Arryn and Hoster Tully's recommendations, etc. Of course, Hoster kicked Littlefinger out, which is part of why he got to start working for Jon Arryn. So that's a lot of little subplots here that line up as well here. That's why this story. That's why we never run out of things to talk about. Yeah, so that's an uncomfortable truth that Ned and Peter actually have, or they have that in common. Jon Arryn is a major influence and benefactor. It went very different directions for that, but with a lot of things in common, like Catelyn and Lysa. Both of them, yeah. There's so many moments like this in a Game of Thrones through Ned's memories. I'm sure I missed some. Like, I'm going to do, when I next finish my full reread of Game of Thrones, I'll be like, oh, that would have been a good thing to point to, that what references Ned's upbringing. And that's why I'm excited to maybe do more of these on different characters, because we'll be able to maybe throw in a few tidbits and comparisons to things that we may have missed in the past.
There's one quote that I found. By the way, something we talked about that I kind of want to make the point of. This is a tricky thing to research. It's hard to there's not the first 4 chapters of the book are about Ned's youth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's spattered through all over the place, and it's hard to find. Yeah. So you kind of really have to kind of research everything to pluck out these little bits. And I was attempted to do that in different areas. I got to give Aziz a lot of credit for having the good intuition and perspective of where to even start with this. But one quote I found that I thought was very interesting, but didn't quite find a way to work it into the document. But now that we're talking about Littlefinger a little bit, he says, I'm pretty sure he's crap. I forgot where the quote was now, but he says, "I once told Ned Stark that when you find yourself naked with an ugly woman, the only thing to do is close your eyes and get on with it." So I don't know if that's part of Ned's education coming from Littlefinger there.
I think it's a lesson he didn't accept. He's like,
yeah, he didn't take that lesson.
You may have taught me that, but I didn't listen. Yeah, it was like, he was Robert in that moment. He's like, no, I don't listen.
Yeah.
So, hearkening back, yeah, there's just so many memories. Not only in the Game of Thrones, it's not just limited to that book where we have Ned's memories, because they're just you pointed this out when we had our weekly meeting, Sean. Take out book 1, and there's still hundreds of mentions of Ned Stark in the rest of the series, because his influence is
literally
so
hundreds, 800 or something.
Yeah. And some subset of that is lessons from him to his various children POVs, of which there are many. So we could have the next book. Jon could think of something Ned taught him, and we'd be like, "Ooh, that would be something cool. We could have included in this episode if we would have thought," because it's probably something he learned from his father, or maybe wishes he had learned from his father. So it's really important for him to pass it on, because he saw how not having that lesson affected him. So he wants to make sure his descendants do have that, which is a big thing in parenting, right? People very often do the same things their parents did, and some of those same people do the opposite things their parents did because they saw the impact of it. And sometimes that pendulum swings too far. Like, you have parents that were too loose, so you're over disciplinarian, and then sometimes these are they were too disciplinarian, so I'm going to be too. Yeah. Sometimes it settles in nicely in the middle. It's human nature. It's not something we can pin down.
Worth noting that sometimes it's not as simple as too loose or too tight, right? Sometimes it could be you're too loose on schoolwork, or too tight on girlfriends, and you also might treat your son different from your daughter, and oldest and the youngest get treated differently. There's all these variations to how you're affected by the nurture of your own upbringing.
Well said.
How it plays out for yourself.
Good said. So it maybe one more time I'll say this. Ned, we won't be getting more memories from Ned. We may get more things he's said. That I think we'll definitely get. But we won't get any more personal memories from him, obviously. He doesn't have any thoughts. He has lots of memories of what he learned from Jon, but none from his father. So that's just pretty interesting. We alluded to that before in terms of just the story maybe doesn't have room for that, but it probably had room. It did have room for a couple sentences here, but George, for whatever reason, opted not to include that, which is pretty interesting. But of course, again, like you said, the nature nurture stuff. Ned was raised when he was older in the era when Jon was his primary influence. One more piece of evidence for Jon being the battlefield commander teacher guy that had a bigger impact is there is a memory of one memory Ned has of Jon is when Robert yells, "Stop this madness in the name of your king," to get Gregor and Sandor to stop fighting. Ned has a flashback of Jon teaching them the importance of a battlefield voice. And he's like, whoa, Robert really put that on display there with his roaring, booming voice that really worked. But there's all those little moments where he thinks of Jon Arryn, and it's like, it's just the 2 sentences. Yeah, it's rich, y'all. Very, very rich. And Nina says that may have come from personal battlefield experience. Like, Jon may have had to yell really loudly at the Peak Rebellion or Peak Uprising or 4th Blackfire. He may remember, like, if I'd been a little louder, this guy's life may have been saved. And so I gotta just practice yelling. Like, that is a skill. You can get louder by practicing your voice. Like, you can be a louder person by practicing that. Like, you can make your...
It's absolutely a skill that's cultivated in the army too. It's a big part of army, I don't know, culture to sing cadence. Like when you're marching or running, to sing songs, and usually there's one person in command who, like, it's like a call response kind of thing. And it's part of your responsibility, typically, when you get promoted to sergeant, to start running PT or marching people around. And you have to enunciate, you have to vocalize. And not only is it a certain level of, like, leadership and confidence, but also the actual ability to get your voice to be loud enough to project for a whole group of people to hear you, even when they're running and breathing and the noises all around and everything else. It is definitely a skill of soldiering.
Nice. Yeah. You know, that makes a ton of sense. And it is hard to yell and be loud when you're running. I mean, you're out of breath. Like, so no wonder it would make you stronger at that. And people that work on their voice, like, your muscles in your chest develop from that. Like, Robert would have had a natural boost there because he had a naturally big chest. Like, that's a real thing. Your voice can emanate from three different main places is how you're taught, like in singing, you know, if you take vocal classes or whatever. So yeah, anyway, it is not to be underestimated as its importance. So fast forward, all this honor and friendship and second dad status, presumably why Jon Snow is named Jon, right? And of course he named his own firstborn Robb with 2 B's for Robb Baratheon, right? Robb B. No child named Rickard, I can't help but notice. There's a Rickon, which is close, but it was his 3rd son after Jon too. So he had already gone. There's already a Brandon and a Jon and a Robb, but no Rickard until Rickon. So yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Maybe that's the order he he ranks them. Ned does. Oh yeah. I wonder why he didn't name either of his daughters Lyanna. I wonder if that was just too painful.
Yeah, too painful.
Now, Arya, excuse me, Arya was his mother's name, or his grandmother's name, so that's a little more, it's kind of easier to figure there. But and Sansa wasn't the first Stark named Sansa either. Anyway, so that's a pretty important thing. So while Ned is super loyal to Robert, I wouldn't say Robert rubbed off of him and on him in terms of Ned growing up to be like him, right? Sometimes, yeah.
Shay, you're muted, by the way.
Oh.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Oh, well, it's good. I was making a dirty joke.
A dirty joke about Robert and Ned rubbing up on each other. Oh. Arya really has that trait too, by the way. Arya is the one that she can be around influential people, but it doesn't really change how she believes. Like, her core values don't really change. She's very set in her ways, and it's hard to move her off of that. And I think Ned is kind of similar. Maybe some of the other Starks aren't quite as rooted that way. Maybe I think Arya is probably the most stubborn like that. Like Arya, when she wants to be taught, she picks things up quickly. Like, look how fast she picked up everything Syrio said. Like, she was all about that. But Septa Mordane had to tell her things 3, 4, 5 times before it's sinking, because she's like, I don't care about this stuff. I'm not invested. You're going to make me do it, but even making me do it isn't going to get me like truly focused and interested. Ned seems to have picked up Jon Arryn's lessons the way Arya picks up Syrio's lessons. That kind of thing. Like, he just was like, this guy is... I'm listening. Like, he is my father figure, and I am bought in. The year 278, Ned would have been 15. Robert and Brandon both turned 16. Robert starts to go back and forth between the Eyrie and Storm's End, like Ned will start to do the next year. And sadly, in one of those first visits back home, maybe the first one, we're not sure, that's when Robert and Stannis see their parents' ship break up in Shipbreaker Bay on their way back from trying to find a bride for Rhaegar. And this is, of course, when Patchface was quote unquote born again in the sea, in the Ironborn manner, shall we say. But he would have returned to the Eyrie at some point. As I said earlier in the episode, this is when they would have grieved together and had all that stuff. And at some point, Ned's mother would have died probably before this. And that would have been, if he was in the Vale, that would have been another time where they have grieved together. So the following year is when Ned would be considered a man grown by Westerosi standards. And he would have gone back and forth. And this is the year Maya Stone was born. Mia Stone was born. So obviously this is why I said at some point Robert started to have the qualities that we identify with him, the negative qualities. And Ned's kind of hushed about this. He's like, yeah, I knew who that girl was. But somehow word of Robert's proclivities gets back to Lyanna. Because when Ned comes back with that offer from whatever the origin of the offer was, which we discussed earlier, Lady Dustin blames it on Maester Wallis, but that's probably not the case. Whatever the origin of the offer was, it was Lyanna to Robert. Ned delivers the document or the letter to Rickard. Rickard may have already known it was coming, but either way, Lyanna's like, I don't want to marry Robert. She's heard about him. She's heard his personality. She's heard about Maya Stone. She knows of this bastard child already. How? Did Ned didn't tell her, as far as we know, because it sounds like he was like aware. He says he was aware of this girl, but there's no indication that he's the reason that Lyanna knows about it. I wondered about this too, and Nina's suspicion is, I wonder if Lyanna tried to interview or investigate servants who came with Ned. Some people that were there, like squires and other serving maids, like Ned wouldn't talk about it, but there would be people who know that she could get the information out of. Being the Lord's daughter, they wouldn't be able to say no to her as easily. And Lyanna's kind of sounds like she's a pretty dominant personality, so she could get the truth if she asked enough people, and those rumors would come out.
Sometimes you can learn as much by what people don't tell you as what they do.
Just their reaction alone. They're like,
the fact that she's trying to ask Ned and he doesn't want to talk about it, that tells her something.
You're right.
You know?
You're right.
Just like when Olenna and Marjorie are questioning Sansa about Joffrey. Sansa doesn't want to say it up front, but that they know what that means.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like, oh, okay, you answered our question. Thank you. Without you're totally right. So Maya Stone, Dina writes, also represents a key distinction between Ned and Jon Arryn, the approach to highborn bastards. For Jon Arryn, presented with a bastard fathered by his foster son, the answer was to install and raise Maya as a servant at the gates of the moon. He gave her a job. If Maya's highborn lineage was not exactly a well-kept secret, well, her fate was still to be raised not as a trueborn daughter of her lordly and future royal father in his own home, but as a lowborn servant far from Storm's End or by the court. By contrast, Ned only brought Jon into his own home, but he raised Jon as a Stark in all but name. So yeah, that is a little bit of a difference. See, that's a good example of Ned not just doing things the way Jon would because he was loyal to him or because his upbringing was the way it was. Ned learned a lot from Jon, but Ned is still his own person that made his own decisions and had his own values, some of which maybe came from his father, even though he wasn't around his father as much as he was around Jon. So that's important. So checking that distinction. Fast forwarding another couple years here, two more years to the tourney at Harrenhal. Of course, the event, as we often say whenever we refer to the tourney at Harrenhal, it's one day, an episode of its own. But it was one of, if not the last major event before the war. So it always comes up. It's super important. He was 18. We know he came from the Eyrie to the tournament of Harrenhal, not from Winterfell. That's important. So he would have come with people there. He hadn't seen Lyanna and Benjen in at least a month, probably several months. But they were there. And so is Brandon and Robert. It's not clear whether Robert also traveled from the Eyrie at the time. He may have come from Storm's End since he was going back and forth as well. But I imagine Ned and Robert coordinated their time at Storm's End or at the Vale somewhat. So when they went back and forth to Winterfell and Storm's End, respectively, they were at least overlapping somewhat so they could see each other. This was also the first time Ned ever met Howland Reed, was the tournament at Harrenhal. That's pretty important. So that's more of an adult Neducation thing, but pretty relevant here that it happened. Which, of course, because it's Also, the first time Lyanna meets Howland Reed, that also comes up very big, given what Lyanna does for him. Ned personally recalls seeing Rhaegar give the crown to Lyanna, as we alluded to earlier. Nina described that Robert was jesting with Lord Hunter and Jon Arryn when this moment occurred. He says all the smiles died, but doesn't actually refer to his own reaction at the time, though Yandel says Ned was calmer but no more pleased than Brandon. So it's interesting that we get a take on Ned from The World of Ice and Fire. The World of Ice and Fire isn't going to have much to say about Ned because he's the second son, and it only, it does, but only in terms of the war. As a battle commander, it doesn't have much to say about his early life because, it's not as historically relevant. Also, the first time meeting Ashara Dane, too, presumably. Big moment for Ned. Maybe his first dance with a girl, as we said before. That would be a milestone moment. He may have danced with someone before, and he may have even made him nervous, but I doubt it was like this at all. Someone that he actually liked, that he was into, that he had a crush on, if not a stronger term, like a teenage falling in love thing, he may have faced his first battle more bravely than he faced Ashara Dane, Some people are like that. Some people do be like that. I wonder about that. Like his stammering and stuttering when he's, use your battlefield voice, Ned. I want to dance with you. Okay, maybe not that battlefieldy of a voice, Ned. Somewhere in between, yeah. Somewhere in between stuttering, looking at your feet, and yelling like Robert. The Mad King enters the fray here. Not only being at the Tournament of Harrenhal, which maybe that was Ned's first experience seeing Aerys, which would be, like a lot of people would be like, yikes. That dude with his 3-foot-long fingernails and his crazy tangled hair and his, shrunken face, and because he doesn't eat very much, and yikes, that's the king. Yeah, setting up even more. It was pretty easy for Ned to take a side in this war, but that would have helped even more. So Lyanna vanishes with Rhaegar around 2 weeks after the Tournament of Harrenhal, basically, or something like that. And Aerys roasts Rickard and strangles Brandon. You guys know that part, but as we mentioned earlier, he kills Elbert Arryn, Kyle Royce, several others as well, including some northern.
Did he burn them also?
No, just regular. Know how they regular execution, as far as we know. Just chop their heads off.
Beheading?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe they were hanged, but I think it was just beheadings, yeah. And Ned likely heard they were going. He was he probably got a letter. It was like, hey, we're heading to King's Landing to settle this. Or Rickard probably did. Brandon rushed off, and got caught. But Rickard, after he was summoned, probably the realm knew about this. He wasn't like, I'm going to sneak out in the night, head down to King's Landing and settle this. No, it was widely known, most likely. And as I alluded to, more than an hour ago, what a monster of a reaction it would have been at the Vale when they got the letter that this had happened, that Ned's father was killed, Ned's brother was killed, Jon Arryn's heir was killed, all these other people were killed. And now he's demanding more heads. He's like, send me Robert and Ned as well, plus some other people. Apparently they weren't the only two being named. And so what did they say? Ned's the quiet one, so it's Robert and...
It would have been surreal. It would have been literally hard for them to believe it was even true at first. Yes. I bet there would have been some amount of attacking the messenger,
Good point. Yeah, how we need to verify this is true. We need to which is exactly what Ned said to Catelyn about Lysa's message. It's like, she's crazy. We can't believe this. No. This is the way she sent the message. It's very cunning and very subtle. She wouldn't do this if he wasn't sure. Yeah, well, okay. They forgot about the, maybe she's lying part, but I forgive Kat for not suspecting her sister of lying. And that's irrelevant to this point anyway. So yeah, you're right. I think you're right. It would have been surreal. There would have been maybe people questioning the veracity of it. Once they got over the hump of believing it, though, the deaths of so many important people, and what are we going to do? We can't just bend to this. We can't just hand them off for execution. So, yeah, we raise the banners. You say, all right, we got to do for Robert. Probably as loud as he was, I imagine he was as loud as anyone, if not the loudest. And I imagine Jon, as mitigating a voice as he was, probably would have been with Robert or lead. Robert would have been following his lead, even because his own heir was just killed. Robert had a little less personal stake in it. A Baratheon wasn't murdered, in that moment. 2 Starks and an Arryn were, though, and some others, right? So, yeah. So they said no. They said no dead kids for you, Aerys. The Arryns had been staunch for the Targaryens for many generations. Recall all the Targaryen-Arryn marriages we've seen. Lots of them. We've been over that plenty of times. But this was far too personal for that old loyalty to matter. And Aerys was clearly in the wrong, even from a king. This is a no-no. And, of course, this may have had a huge impact on Ned, besides saving his life, obviously. Jon refusing to give up children to the Targaryens. Ned, this is one of the things he's most staunch on later. This principle of, well, here's the quote.
Robert, I ask you, what did we rise against Aerys Targaryen for, if not to put an end to the murder of children? Of
course, Robert's answer is cold. Again, this is the reversal of ice and fire again. Robert's answer is to put an end to Targaryens, And it's like, but why? Right? It's not just because. It's not just because. No, you put an end to Targaryens because this one was killing children and adults, but but especially the children is one that had gone too far.
However much Robert even recognizes about himself, he has a new motivation now, which is to maintain his authority as the king. Yeah. Right? There's this other claim to the throne that's out there, and however much he realizes or cares about that, there's plenty of people whispering it in his ear.
Yeah.
But to Ned, that's not a factor. You don't kill the kids. That's not a reason,
True. Yeah, he's like, yeah, you can't. Yeah, he says that earlier. He's like, we kill children, we kill adults for the wrongs they do, not children for the wrongs they may do later. Because this is all wrapped up in that argument about Dany, about sending assassins to get Dany. And he says it would be vile, unspeakable, Ned does. And Robert roars at him like, what Rhaegar did to your sister was vile and unspeakable. And you kind of wonder, are they replaying the same sort of things that were yelled when they got that news about Aerys killing Brandon? And it's like, no, that's vile, that's unspeakable. Like that, this is the same roaring they did then, except they were on the same team then. They were roaring about they were both agreeing on what needed to be done about this injustice. But here they're split, and Ned's the one holding to those old values where Robert has changed, and that's why Ned has so many thoughts about this is the man I used to love or whatever. It's not this guy.
Even though they might have agreed back then about what needed to be done, that the thing they would have been agreeing on was kill King Aerys.
Yes,
they did. Ned at least did not want to kill those kids. Right. I don't know if Robert would have or not. But thankfully, I guess I don't know. Thankfully, with some perspective. Tywin took care of it, or Gregor took care of it, or whatever. But I don't know. I don't know if Robert would have done it. Like if Tywin and or Gregor hadn't done it, do you think Robert would have murdered those kids? And if he did, could Ned have forgiven that? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You're right. I mean, Ned does have that thought. It was like, yeah, I mean, that kind of, or I don't know if actually maybe it wasn't Ned, but yeah, he thought it was like, yeah, Robert wanted to be the hero, and you can't murder children and still be a hero. It's like it's a tightrope walk there. So yeah, it was kind of Tywin did sort of handle that for him in a way that absolved him what would have been an extremely difficult decision, like fostering them or just removing them from making them join the Silent Sister, or not the Silent Sisters, but the Wall or something like that.
And just adding to, I don't know how crappy Robert is, why I like Robert so little is because now that he has the power, they go, all right, whatever, let's just do it. He's just totally become corrupt and abandoned his morality and everything. So.
Yeah, good point. All right, so since Ned left such a strong impact on his children, along with Kat, of course, who also left a strong impact on their mutual children, and by understanding him and his own upbringing, we can understand some of the ways in which he treats his own children and views children as a whole. And a lot of the ways he behaves as a person come back to this upbringing, which is true for every human. It makes this discussion, I think, maybe a little more weighty than a lot of our episodes because it's so relatable in a lot of ways to real life. Even we don't have the same struggles as Ned or most people in Westeros, but we do have family members we care about, and we have family drama. We have things that split us apart. We grow older and change, and we look back on our childhood and learn how it's impacted us long after the fact. And yeah, we pass that down onto people who are under our authority, whether we're parents of them or just people that are looked up to by younger folks in some manner or another. Like all humans, Ned's upbringing heavily influences how he acts. His distaste of Tywin again, the stance against the death of children, his desire to avoid Southern politics. As we've said countless times, digging deep into A Song of Ice and Fire is rewarding. All these things continue to make sense, if not more sense, because you could see the connective tissue holding all this stuff together and supporting it and setting it up in a way that feels very human. George puts the story first, but he doesn't sacrifice these elements to make things fit. Not only does this further cement our notion that these books are extremely well crafted, but it paves the way for further episodes of this nature featuring different characters. Now, we've seen this works really well. We can do it with other characters. Bran, that would be a good next step because he's the one we see it firsthand with more. But Catelyn, Theon would be a really interesting one because he's divided in two worlds. That's one of the ones I threw out there. Some of the House of the Dragon characters, we see their upbringing, both on show and in book in different ways. He has this was a meaty subject, so we'll come back to it at some point. But we've got lots of other topics in the queue as well. It's a rich vein of material that we always mine here. The mine of topics is a big, vast, endless mine. Next week is Baelor Breakspear, for example. As I said, don't forget, it won't be a live stream. It will be released as a premiere. So you can still hang out during the live premiere of it, or just catch it later on podcast version or on the YouTube side. The trivia question. Let's have our answer, shall we? The question was, who's the first person to take a drink of anything, alcoholic or not? Jon Snow. His first chapter is at the banquet, when they have the welcoming banquet for Robert and Cersei and the family when they arrive, and he's just sitting back having a sip of wine, as this like 2 or 3 paragraphs into his chapter. And prior to that, I didn't see anyone else taking a drink, so it's possible I missed something, but I don't think so. I think that's like the 5th chapter. Catelyn doesn't take a drink, Ned doesn't take a drink, Bran doesn't take a drink, and no one in the prologue does, so yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was someone in the prologue. That was my instinct to guess, but I couldn't specifically remember it all.
Yeah, like I said, it's possible I missed a one-liner where they paused for a sip, but I just didn't see that, so. Correct me if I'm wrong.
My next guess might have been Tyrion or Robert, because they're seem to be the heaviest drinkers,
yeah.
But
because
Jon,
it doesn't have to be their chapter. Yeah, you could have seen. Yeah, Robert was who I thought people would guess, because you also see him pretty early on, like Ned's first chapter, and yeah. Anyway, thanks y'all for coming. If you want to stay immersed and listen to more episodes that relate to this one, House Royce episode touches on some of the Stark connections as well as a lot of other things. The Reigns of Castamere episode was mentioned because we mentioned the Reigns of Castamere early on in this one. War of Ninepenny Kings comes up a lot. The Life of Joanna Lannister would be interesting because it touches on a lot of the same things Tywin was doing, and it covers some of the same era, the 260s and 270s, and a little before, as well as Valar Aretas Ned chapters. Of course, that's a rich vein of material on Ned as well. So check that out if you haven't already, or maybe it's time for a re-listen.
One other thing that we hadn't mentioned, but we should, is that Jokic and the Nuggets are in the finals.
Yes, because we always make sure to talk about basketball on
it's exciting here in Denver, I'm telling you, man.
Speaking of mining, yeah, they're nuggets. Right?
Yeah, there you go. A rich vein.
If you are a supporter of our show on Patreon or Spotify or through donations via our website, we are much appreciative of that. We do rely on your support. You can sign up there. We have our $2 level still available only for a couple more months. It will be going away for good in August. So sign up now to get grandfathered in, because you can keep that $2 level even after the price goes up. And it will be set that way as long as you want to keep it there. So the last 2 months of that, we're winding it down. Thanks as well to Nina for her great notes. A lot of great takes, a lot of good insight. Some of it, not only are her takes great, but they lead me to takes that are my own that I take credit for, but are partly influenced by her. So it's a two-way street when you have influence like that. Joey, Jesse, and Bran, I thank you for the help with our intro music and our video intro as well. Michael Klarfeld, that as well, plus the maps behind us. And our Benjeneer, who does great work with our audio quality and has a fun nickname that I like to shout out because it's just so cool. Benjeneer, yeah. Pat myself on the back for that one. And I will see you all alongside Sean and Ashea next time. And you know what to do before then. Valar, read us.